LHIAC System of Care program here at the summit. Today I am offering a land acknowledgement, a formal recognition of the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed and displaced from their annual ancestral homelands and territories. These acknowledgements mark the initial strides towards creating a brighter future where we actively combat the ongoing eradication of indigenous voices, lives, and histories. We affirm the sovereignty of tribal nations and tribal lands, recognizing the painful history and ongoing intergenerational impacts of genocide, forced assimilation, and displacement experienced by Native communities in the U.S. and its territories. We urge everyone participating in this summit, regardless of location, to actively engage and serve the indigenous peoples of your respective cities, counties, and regions or states. By including and honoring them in your programs, you acknowledge their ancestral connection to the lands that you operate in and contribute to their well-being and resilience. Dr. Gia Kelly will now provide the labor acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that. And now we will go into our labor acknowledgement. A labor acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes the unpaid labor and forced servitude of people of color as a factor in our country's economic development. And it's a way to honor the legacies of settler colonialism and the violent histories of our past. So today we acknowledge that our country was built on the labor of forcefully enslaved African people who were kidnapped and brought to the US during the transatlantic slave trade. And we recognize the continued contribution of their descendants. We acknowledge and remember those Black Americans who were beaten and lynched during the time of segregation and Jim Crow, and those who are still suffering while fighting for their freedom. We remember those who toiled the ground where many of us have the privilege to live, to work, and to play. And lastly, we acknowledge the immigrant and American-born workers of African, Asian, and Central and South American descent whose labor remains hidden in the shadows, but still contributes to the well-being of our collective community. Thank you. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Neil Horan for our welcome.
I thought it sounded great in here, and now I'll actually say it to all of you. So I'm really excited. I'm Neil Horan, co-director of the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children, Youth, and Family Mental Health. Tracy Levins, our co-director, isn't able to be with us right now. She'll be with us later today. Otherwise, it would never let me do this. I can't even unmute to get us started, but I try. NTAC, which is what you'll hear our center called over the next few days, is very excited to welcome all of you here with us. And I love seeing in the chat just people welcoming each other from all over the country. And thanks to Mark and Dr. Kelly for opening us up. NTAC is comprised of a number of partners, and I just want to acknowledge all of those partners because the work that you're going to see over the next few days, this summit, while you're going to see Ashley, who's really been our lead in many ways, you're going to see a lot of our team and a lot of the behind the scenes folks that you don't get to hear a lot. Really just want to acknowledge all the hard work that everybody's done from our team. The center is led by a group of organizations: CARS, Georgetown, Change Matrix, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Youth Move National, FREDLA, and University of Texas at Austin. No particular order in that, but you should know that all of these partners contribute a great deal to all of the work that we do here at the center. And that work will be on display here over the next few days. And that work is inclusive of not only federally funded system of care communities that we work with, but all of you. And it's really important to acknowledge our partners in this work. First, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. As we call them, the two Emilys, Emily Lickvar and Emily Hassey, but all of our federal project officers have really been helping us to lead in supporting the field in this country and the tribal nations and the communities and the indigenous people that we work with. Most importantly, all of you. We're super excited to have all of you with us. 30 keynotes, seminars, all kinds of presentations, lots of networking. We really want you to be talking with one another. The learning is going to happen both in and out of those sessions. Really take advantage of all of those opportunities. There's over 4,000 people registered. I was going to say 1.4 million because my children tell me a lot about social media. I've heard it's a very big thing. It might take off soon. So we're super excited to have so many people here, so many people registered, so many people interested in addressing the mental health of our country and of all the indigenous people. I'm also excited that we are going to kick off today with Dr. Anita Everett from SAMHSA. Dr. Everett is the director of the Center for Mental Health Services within SAMHSA, our key partner in all of this work. Prior to that, Dr. Everett was at Johns Hopkins, and we are just honored that Dr. Everett's going to help kick us off this week. To all of you, thanks for being here. Take advantage. We're really excited to have you joining us for the next few days. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Anita Everett.
Whoops.
Welcome, Dr. Everett. We can hear you.
Okay, that's good. And can you see me?
Not right now.
I'll try to turn the thing. Okay, how about now?
There we go. We can
All right,
see you
good.
and hear you. Fantastic.
All right, sorry. We've all gotten better at troubleshooting, I believe. So thank you very much. So I do, what an honor and privilege to be here to welcome everybody to this wonderful series of a couple days in the context of May is Mental Health Month. We hope everyone's taken some time to reflect a little bit on what that means, that we have a whole month that's set aside to sort of have our nation or encourage our nation to think about their own mental health and the mental health of those around them. And in some cases, those of us who are providers, the mental health of those who come and seek our services. This is the 2024 System of Care Summit. And I want to thank also Mark and Gia for your thoughtful land and labor acknowledgements and for the reminding us of the importance of recognizing and acknowledging the history and contributions of Indigenous peoples and peoples of color in our nation. Neil, your gracious introduction sets the tone for what promises to be a transformative event. And we want to invite everyone to think of it that way. Take a pulse check as you're going through the next couple of days, see where you are with it and make sure that you're getting the most out of it. It's a little bit hard sometimes, as we all know, to get as much out of a virtual meeting as we do in-person meetings. So we hold you to that, to your commitment to being here. So thank you for that. This System of Care or SOC Summit is hosted by the NTAC, as was mentioned, and together with SAMHSA. SAMHSA is deeply invested in the mental health of young people as we embark on this 3-day journey together. I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about this year's summit theme, which is All Systems Go, taking action together. As you probably know, over the last decade, young people have demonstrated alarming increases in anxiety, depression, and other behavioral health challenges. In 2021, our U.S. Surgeon General's Advisory Board released a call to action for all Americans to seize the moment and step up for our children and their families. This advisory calls for improved coordination across all levels of government to address youth mental health needs, increase work to reduce discrimination and biases related to mental health, and to support the mental health need of youth involved in the juvenile justice system. In short, it affirms the need for collaboration and coordinated efforts across all systems, a very core element, of course, in our Systems of Care series of grants. This sentiment is echoed in both the theme and offerings of this year's summit, Systems of Care Summit. This summit is a very special space created to connect us in our shared purpose, and it energizes our work with children, youth, and families. Over the next 3 days, you'll have the opportunity to participate in some truly transformational programming. You can join in intensive implementation training on equity-driven and trauma-informed organizational practices. Hear 4 dynamic and engaging keynote presentations, choose from almost 40 breakout sessions, participate in interactive networking sessions, and have unlimited access to a variety of on-demand, thought-provoking, and lightning talks. So as I looked through the agenda myself, there's all kinds of titles of events that really are intended to and will captivate your interest and hold your attention so that you advance your knowledge and connectedness with regards to this really difficult work. As we come here together today, I'd like to encourage each of you to embrace this year's theme. Our shared mission to make all systems go relies on the application of a coordinated, comprehensive, and equitable framework for a system of care. This includes collaborating with formal systems and community-based supports, incorporating youth and family voice and choice in all aspects of our work, advancing equity-driven and trauma-informed practices, and continually innovating to meet the evolving needs of our communities and our children. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Using a system of care framework and related collaborative efforts can be complex, messy, challenging. But as we all know, most things worth doing are worth it. It's through these challenges that we grow, learn, and ultimately make meaningful change. It's through the collective efforts of everyone in this room, all 3,500 of you who registered for this event, that we truly make a difference. So get ready for some incredible learning experiences. With registrants representing all 50 states, multiple tribes and territories, this summit offers unparalleled opportunities to learn from diverse perspectives, forge new partnerships and friendships, and collectively advance our efforts to support the mental health and well-being of children, youth, and families across our nation. And don't let the summit end with the closing session on Thursday afternoon. Let's commit to taking action together with continued learning, collaboration, and advocacy. Share your learnings with your colleagues and communities. Make it a priority to participate in future training opportunities offered by NTEC. It's my honor at this time to stand beside you in this important work. At SAMHSA, we maintain a deep commitment to children, youth, and family mental health and to the system of care approach. We will continue to provide strong leadership, robust funding opportunities, and expert technical assistance to create, bolster, and maintain systems of care nationwide. Together, we can create a future where every child, every young person, and every family has access to the support they need to thrive. Let's implement the knowledge we will gain in the next few days. Let's foster partnerships, and let's champion policies and practices that prioritize the mental health and well-being of all children, youth, and families. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for your service and the work that you do every day to create comprehensive and equitable systems of care. And now, without further ado, I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to Ashley Singleton, who's the NTAC project manager. She also serves as the lead and co-chair of the 2024 Summit Committee. She will guide us through the rich discussions and inspiring sessions that lie ahead. Ashley?
Thank you, Dr. Everett, and welcome everyone. So excited to see you all. And I'm excited also to invite Crystal Bragg, who will be offering American Sign Language for our implementation training. So welcome, Crystal. Okay, so I am going to do a quick tutorial of the AirMeet platform. I've already provided an orientation on the platform. You can watch it and rewatch it as much as you like. So if you miss something as we go over the next few slides, that's okay. You can rewatch this, the recording that can be found in AirMeet. So we do offer live translation and live closed captioning for the summit. If you look to the right-hand side of your screen, there are black icons with a white background. At the very top, there is a chat icon. Most of you all have found that chat icon. There are two chat bubbles on top of one another. You click on that, and then you click on the blue button that says Live Closed Captioning and Translation. When you click on that button, this is where you will find the next steps to start the Spanish translation and the live closed captioning. So if you do not see that, I see some hearts going up, so I'm hoping that means that you all were able to successfully access that. If you are having any issues accessing the translation, please let myself, you can let me know, or a member of our team, Carrie DeSell or Bridget. They are in the chat and ready to respond to any issues that you may have. Next up, so I've showed you all the steps for the live translation, the closed captioning. I also want to share with you all a quick disclaimer that we are privileged to be supported and funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All views and opinions expressed in the sessions that will happen over the next few days and the materials presented by our speakers are solely those opinions of the speakers and of the presenters. They do not represent the official views of SAMHSA or the U.S. government. I also want to bring our attention to the accountability commitment. And I hope that everyone in the room today, there are over 500 people here, I hope that we all can commit to creating spaces that uphold the highest level of integrity and respect and professionalism. And as we journey together, we pledge together to foster a welcoming and inclusive, equitable environment that rejects discriminatory, derogatory, oppressive, and violent language, behaviors, and actions. I hope we all can agree to stand firm in this commitment. And if you stand firm in this commitment with me, please put some hearts out there for me. Put some hearts in the chat. I'd love to see your commitment to staying accountable throughout the summit. We also recognize that everyone's schedules are demanding. We know that in this work that you all are supporting children and families, and that work doesn't just turn off because you're in an event. So as we gather for this dialogue-driven, idea-exchanging summit, we do hope that you can prioritize your presence and participation as much as possible. Please know we understand if you need to take a break, but as you can, stay connected. This summit is only great because you're here, because you're engaged, because you're connected. So if we want to have a successful time together and really make a change, we need to all commit to staying present when we can. We have breaks throughout the summit, up to 30 minutes. We hope that you'll use that time to check emails or check your phone as you need. And I appreciate you all committing to being here and being present. Neil has already addressed all of the partners, but you know, we really can't shout out our partners enough. Thank you so much to all of our partner organizations that make this summit happen, and also that make all of the trainings that we offer throughout the year happen. So thank you for all of your hard work and your diligence. So as a quick overview, this summit is a no-cost registration. We also offer up to 11 no-cost continuing education hours. I'm going to go over in just a second how you can access the request form for those CE hours. But please know registration is not closed. It's not closed. So if you are really enjoying your time here with us today, please feel free to continue to share and forward the announcement about this summit with your network. We really do appreciate it. We have over 4,000 people registered. Let's make it 5,000, maybe 6. The sky is the limit. So please continue to help us to promote the summit and this incredible event that we're going to have together. There's also instant replay. Please note that all of the sessions will be recorded. You will have instant access to all of the sessions after they end. I'll show you how to get access to those. We're also going to upload all of these sessions to our YouTube channel after the summit. So we encourage you to follow our YouTube channel if you're not already a follower or subscriber of that, so that you can have access to all of these recordings. All right, moving right along. I'm going to pick up the pace just a little bit so we can get right into our implementation training with Dr. Stewart. So on the right-hand side, we're going to go back to these icons, the black icons that have a white background. There's a Q&A function there. I see that several people have already found it. Grace, Sierra, Cheryl, thanks for putting your questions there. Please, as you have questions for the speakers, leave your questions in this space. As you all have already seen, the chat moves very quickly, so it's difficult for us to keep track of all the things in the chat. Please use the Q&A. Also in the Q&A, you may notice right underneath, let's see, who's the first message? Laura has left a message here about the sessions being recorded. Right underneath Laura's question, there's a little up arrow, and there are 17 people who have upvoted that question. If there is a question that you see in this space that you really like to see an answer to, you can click upvote, and that way it calls that question to the speaker's attention. You can also leave a comment if you have a follow-up question that's related to what's there. So those are ways that you can interact in the Q&A area. Next up is the polls. So I am going to launch a poll right now. Well, we've already launched it. 234 people have responded. Awesome. So I'm going to show this poll on the stage. So some of the speakers may have taken the option to have a poll within AirMeet. And when they launch a poll within AirMeet, this is where you'll be able to find it. Now, some folks have decided to use Mentimeter or other apps like that to launch a poll. That's perfectly fine. We'll make sure that you have access to those links and QR codes so you can access the polls. Thanks so much for folks who have already responded to the poll that's launched. I'm going to close that poll now. All right, next up is the icon with 2 pieces of paper that are stacked on top of each other. This is where you can find resources for sessions. So all of the resources as we have them available from the speakers will be uploaded in this space. So if you're looking for a handout or a slide deck for a particular session, it can be found in that area. You can download and open those links. And when you open the link, just know it will open in a new tab. All right, next up, you can also expand and minimize your screen. So if you hover your mouse right over the hashtag SOC Summit 2024, on the right-hand corner, there's a gray box that has white little lines, 4 corners. Once you click that box, it will expand your screen. If you want to minimize your screen, you can press Escape on your keyboard and it will minimize the screen, or you can press that gray box and it will minimize it there as well. Just know as you expand and minimize your screen, it will adjust the video of the speakers. So be sure that you adjust it to meet your preference. Okay, so next up, we've covered all of the icons that are within the session. The event also has icons. So the black icons with the light blue background, this is how you navigate the event itself. So really quickly, I think a lot of folks have found this already, but just to let you know that you can click on schedule, you can join your sessions when you click on schedule. And also, while I'm going through these next few slides, feel free to follow along with me. I know I'm a visual learner. I'm also a kinetic learner. So if you need to follow along, please feel free to do that. So once you click on schedule, you can join sessions here. You can also bookmark sessions. And this is where you will also be able to find the instant replay button when a session ends. Okay. All of the sessions are recorded except for the networking lounge. That space will not be recorded due to some of the limitations of the platform. Also, once you click on schedule, you can filter sessions by tags or tracks. So the summit offers several different tracks, and you can look at sessions organized in that way. If you just click on those boxes, it will show you the sessions as they are organized by tracks or tags. One other thing I forgot to mention is that, I'll tell you about that in a second. We're going to keep moving along. All righty. So next up across your event navigation bar is a trophy. This is your leaderboard. So yes, we are offering engagement points for the summit. The more you engage with the platform, meaning you respond to polls, you post questions in the Q&A, the more points that you can accumulate. So when you click on that trophy and then you click on activities, you can learn how many points you get for each activity. So just giving a quick shout out to Grace and Kelly and Melissa. They are on the top of the leaderboard already, and you can join them. Just check out the activities to see how you can gain points. We are providing prizes each day. So there will be 5 winners each day. We have a $50 gift card, virtual tea time with me, some books, including a book by one of our keynote speakers, and artist, therapist Lindsay Brom has put together a special gift bundle that has some really great tools that you can use with the people that you serve as a part of our gift bundle as well. So engage, 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 and earn those points as you join us over the next 3 days. There's also a newspaper icon on the event navigation bar. This is where you can leave messages for the entire event, not just a particular session. The people icon lets you know who's in the space with us and who we're sharing the space with. When you click on a person's name in that space, you can also send them a direct message. You can also schedule a meeting with people in the platform. So if somebody says something that really catches your eye in the chat and you'd like to talk with them, you can schedule a meeting and have a meeting with them right here in AirMeet. I see some wows going up. Yeah, lots of ways to engage with the summit and network with the people here in the space. So in order to see your direct messages, if you click on that comment icon, that's where you can review your DMs. And then last but not least, that bell notification lets you know when we at Intact send notification messages out to you all. All right. Whew, let me breathe for a second. So did you notice something? That when you click on these icons in the event area, it covers the session icons. It covers the session icons. So if you click on DM or if you click on the trophy, it is now covering the session chat. So you want to be sure that you are clicking that X in the right-hand corner so that you can see what's happening in the session. Otherwise, you may accidentally send a message to the entire event that you meant to send to a particular session. So let's do a really quick exercise, and I'm going to take 1 more minute and get out of your hair. Really quick exercise in the event feed. Remember, that's your newspaper icon. In the event feed, let us know, what is your favorite color? Right in the feed, what is your favorite color? All right, I see some blue, I see some yellow, purple. Ashley said red. That's my favorite color as well. I am a Delta, so red is my favorite color. Green, great, awesome. I see a lot of great colors right there. All right, next up, in the session chat, what is your favorite day of the week? In the session chat, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Excellent. Okay. So just be aware, y'all, as you're moving throughout sessions, be aware, are you leaving a message in the session chat or are you leaving a message in the event feed? Make sure you're paying attention to that so folks can see what you're talking about. All right. So I don't want to take too much more time from Dr. Stewart and the implementation training, some really great things happening. Just know that really quickly that when you are in on the reception page, all of these circles on the page are clickable. So if you want to learn more about CE hours, you click that circle and you can find more information there. The summit program is in both English and in Spanish. And also a quick note, we do have an AirMeet help desk. It is not open all day, okay? It's not open all day. It is only available 15 minutes before and after the start of sessions. So if you are running into technology glitches, you'll need to go in a little bit early to get those glitches resolved. CE hours, there are up to 11 no-cost CE hours available. Please give us about 3 weeks to process those requests. They don't come automatically. There are over 4,000 of you all here, so it's going to take us a little time to process all of those. Last but not least, starting tomorrow and then again on Thursday, we have a wellness room available for all of our guests here today. Tomorrow and on Thursday, those wellness room spaces are available for folks if you need to decompress, if you need a breather. We talk about a lot of heavy stuff. There's a lot of content that we go through. So if you need a break, visit our wellness room. We have cool things happening there. Adult recess, animal camp, some really great things happening. So be sure to visit our wellness room starting tomorrow. Our lightning talks can be found if you click on booths. You can find our lightning talks. You can find out more about our partners there as well, and all of the resources that we have available for all of the presenters throughout the summit can be found by clicking on resources, and you can download those resources there. All righty. Woo! A lot of information. But I hope that this all helps you stay connected, engaged throughout the summit. Again, we are one direct message away. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to send a message to any of us on the screen. And thank you. With that, I am going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Suki Steckel, who will introduce Dr. Ashley Stewart. Thank you for your time.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suki Steckel. I am the System of Care Lead for INTAC, and I'm very pleased to join you today from Nashville, Tennessee, where the cicadas have been singing their beautiful song for some time now. And we're so happy that you all have joined us today for this very, very exciting implementation training. And so it is my honor and my privilege to introduce you to Dr. Ashley Stewart. Ashley is the Director of Health Equity and a Racial Equity Subject Matter Expert at C4 Innovations. Her work centers on addressing institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression, and she works in solidarity with mental and behavioral health providers and supports institutions, corporations, organizations, and leadership teams to identify ways to reduce harm and determine appropriate steps towards sustainable culture change. And she is here today to walk us through 3 hours of very, very compelling learning around advancing healing-centered organizations through equity-driven and trauma-informed practices. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Ashley Stewart.
Suki, thank you so much. You all, thank you so much to the summit. I am just thrilled and excited to be here. The energy in here is amazing. So I know that we're going to get into some awesome conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's jump right into our content for today. All right. While I'm pulling this up, folks, how you feeling? Tell me in the chat how you're feeling. Great, sleepy, good, excited to be here. I'm excited to be here too. Excited, sleepy. Shannon, maybe we get a nap later, yeah? Excited and grateful. That's awesome. Rachel's doing a dance. I love it. So just a little bit about me. I think talking about what brings me to this work is also really good level setting for the conversation that we're having around advancing healing-centered organizations through equity-driven and trauma-informed practices. So as Suki mentioned, I'm the director for the Center for Health Equity at C4 Innovations. I also am a professor, an assistant professor at Temple University, where I've developed several courses in our social justice sequence. So the instructional aspect of it as well. I have the privilege of having served and continuing to serve as a mental health provider and a behavioral health provider. I've had the opportunity to do consulting around sustainable culture change. I don't know about you all, but I've been having a lot more conversations about equity, more so now than ever before. And I've seen an increased interest in people wanting to talk about how to sustain it. Like, what are those next steps? And so we're going to spend some time talking about next steps today. Yeah. Awesome. I love the GIFs that are coming in the chat. These are so great. I also have the opportunity to be a researcher looking at institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression. So that's the biggest part of my research. So working with individuals, seeing how they are navigating through complex systems, working with young folks, seeing how they're navigating through complex systems, families having to really advocate for themselves. I wanted to also be able to take an approach to address the institutional issues that were creating the greatest barriers and the greatest inequities for the communities I was serving. And so my research drastically shifted to look at institutional practices, how to support organizations that are doing amazing work, but want to do it in a more equitable way. That is where my work has landed, and I absolutely love it. And then most importantly to me in this space, I'm a person with many intersecting identities that show up in these slides, but most importantly, that really inform my work and create an opportunity for me to be able to engage with the communities that I serve. So that's a little bit about me in this context. Yeah. All right. Y'all ready to get into it? Amazing. All right. I see some folks having some connection issues. We'll definitely drop the link into the chat so that you can be able to check in on that. We want everybody to be able to hear. Awesome. So we have a few objectives for today. The first is to understand the intersection of equity and trauma-informed practices, recognizing that for us to be trauma-informed and healing-centered, we must begin to embrace equity, and equity is a part of that. We're going to talk about the impact of systemic oppression. We're going to enhance our awareness of identity-based trauma. We're going to develop skills to address and create healing-centered environments. We're going to use self-reflection and role analysis in organizational culture, and we'll break down what that means and all those words and things like that, as well as assess and implement organizational change strategies. So what's those next steps to do? Yeah. Beautiful. A few things to ground. I'm so grateful for the land and labor acknowledgement. I also wanted to say questions are welcome throughout, chat engagement is welcome throughout. But with this group, I don't even need to say that because it's already going. I love it. I will be answering questions throughout as they come up. So please do utilize those features that Ashley shared with us so that we can have a conversation throughout. I also want to take a moment to welcome conversations or things that you are bringing up around the advocacy that you're doing connected to it. I also want to take a note here for a moment that I will be intentionally paced. So I see that there are some delays in the chat feature for some folks. So let's just let folks continue to contribute and participate. I'll also give some time in between questions I pose to give you all time to type and contribute. So we'll be thoughtful and intentional about that together. I'm very grateful for all of the accessibility features that are naturally integrated into this platform. The thoughtfulness around inclusivity is absolutely important to me, and I think this platform is doing it really well. Of course, if there's any other opportunities for us to create accessibility around this or to encourage participation across our multitude of beautiful neurodiversities, please let us know so that we can do that. And if you have any trouble finding captions or translations, let us know so we can connect you to that. And then I want to just acknowledge that I get to do this work on the land of the Lene Lenape. And so I just want to ground myself there. Right? There are so many great, amazing Karina engagement features. Yeah, I like it too, Tanya. All right, so let's get into the content. We're going to start off today talking about equity-centered, trauma-informed best practices. Now, these are things that I personally use tried and true. I don't engage any conversation without kind of level setting myself here. And so I'm going to introduce them. I have a couple asks for you all as I introduce them. While I'm reading through them, I would love for you to emphasize in the chat ones that stand out to you. If you have any questions about any of them, please put it into the chat. Yeah, and so the first is to expect a lack of closure. This is a journey. I like to call it the bow effect. Sometimes we'll come into this a session like advancing healing-centered organizations, and we're like, yeah, we're going to leave. We're going to be equity-centered and trauma-informed. It's going to be done. No, we're going to leave with more questions, more opportunities to engage these conversations thoroughly. And so we want to leave the present open without tying a bow on it and recognize that this is a process. I want to ask for clarification. It's a plus 500 for quite some time. I can only imagine the true number of people we have in this space here today. So we want to continue to lean into that, to recognize that, and ask for clarification. Yeah, Karina, I love that. Embracing discomfort, things that grow and shift and change, experience a discomforting process. Now, that doesn't always mean that discomfort is necessarily negative for some of us. Sometimes we like a nice growing edge, but in general, if our things are feeling a little disruptive, it might mean that it's an opportunity to lean in. And so we want to embrace discomfort. We want to acknowledge that this work is for us, not for other people. There's something for all of us to do in this work. I want to honor all experiences and expertise, acknowledging that both come in many different forms. And a lot of times when I talk about honoring expertise, people often think, professional expertise. I want to bring into this space today, as we're talking about service to children and families and behavioral health, we are talking about the lived and living expertise in this room. And so I want to honor, as we go through our content today, folks who experience a reflection of your own lived and living expertise, and welcome you to bring that into the space. It's welcome. It's encouraged, and it's important for all of us. This is going to be both a safe and brave space, a brave space for us to ask critical questions, a safe space for us to learn new things, and recognizing what feels inherently safe to me might require some bravery for other folks, and vice versa. You might bring in a question that's really going to encourage my bravery to talk about it, and I want that to happen. That would make me very happy, and it'll also help facilitate some dynamic conversation. I love this, and folks are putting in great things in the chat. I just want to uplift many talents besides the letters and our names. Absolutely. Having lived and living expertise is something that professional training can't replicate. It has its own unique value. Yeah, I love it. My absolute favorite is revisiting welcome. And this one acknowledges that we have a lot of different processing styles. I don't know. Let me see some hearts in the chat or hearts on the screen. If you're the type of person that it's like 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, 3 a.m. or the next day, and you're like, that's the thing that I really wanted to say, or, oh, I should have mentioned this. And we have these moments, right? Yeah, we have these moments where we reflect on things after we've had a chance to sit with it and to marinate. And I'll be honest with you, 3 hours, we have a lot of slides, a lot of content to cover. And at any and every point in our time today, you are welcome to bring something back from a slide or section earlier. We're going to go through about 8 sections of content. I don't care if we're on 8 and you want to come back to 1. We're going to create a space where revisiting is welcome. We're allowed to come back to things after we've processed it. We're allowed to speak on things as when we're excited and it bubbles up and it's at the front of our attention. And so it gives grace to all the different ways that we can process in this space. Years later, I love that, Bex. You gotta let him Maryland, Jaylene, right? Affirm and give credit. We want to hype each other up. I see a lot of hearts and thumbs and affirmations on things that people are saying in the chat. I definitely want to continue to create an environment where we see that. And then we're going to revoke expert positioning. And I see a great question in the chat by Debbie. What does revoke expert positioning mean? Many of you, if not most or all of you, are in positions where people look to you for answers. We have to be experts. We have to answer questions. We have to address things. And this is an opportunity, especially when we're having equity-centered conversations, to revoke that positioning that we often have to occupy, to allow ourselves to be present, to allow ourselves to hear, right? So the next one's listening to understand, even, even if that means not listening to respond, but just being present with people, sometimes requires us to take off our expert hat or give ourselves permission to lean into that. Yeah, great questions. I love that, Melissa, the transparency. Tamika. You'll notice that I'll read some things that are coming up in the chat just to make sure that anyone who's not able to access the chat can also be able to reflect on some of the amazing things that are being said in the chat. My second favorite is probably accountability is kind. And this one I think is really important for us together today. Sometimes people are a little anxious or uncomfortable or even concerned when it comes to having conversations that really go deeply into equity, that really challenge and call into conversation the things we need to lean into. And often that's because some of us have not had the best experiences with it. Well, all 500 plus people here have opted to come into a session around advancing healing, centered organizations, equity and trauma-informed practices, meaning that we have a commitment, a mutual commitment to reducing harm, to being more equitable, to being more trauma-informed, for being more healing-centered. And that's our baseline. So accountability is kind of pivots or shifts our consideration about like call in or call out culture. And it says that if I'm here and I'm committed to this, that this is something that I would like to do, areas where I'd like to reduce harm, someone letting me know and bringing it to my attention, anything that happens that is counter to it is very kind. So Suki says to me, hey, Ashley, I noticed that you were using this particular language. I just wanted you to know how that language might be received by a community. That's a very kind thing to do. It's kind because it gives me the opportunity to do something different. It's kind because it gives me the opportunity to acknowledge it in the moment, to address and to repair harm. It's kind because it requires courage for Suki to tell me that. That's very kind of Suki to do. And most importantly, it's kind to the people who I likely would not harm in that same way again because of my increased awareness. So accountability is kind. It helps us all move toward this assumptive goal that we have, which in this session today, we know what that assumption is. Yeah. So I love to reframe that, Jolene. I love that you love that framing. Accountability is kind, so we can be accountable for the impact of our words and actions. I also love to be gentle with ourselves and others and give ourselves grace. I will continuously use myself as an example through this. Listen, I've literally studied this for over a decade, and there are times when I just don't get it right. And the first thing I want to do is like stand on the desk and be like, I know this. Like, I am considered a person with lived experience and expertise in this area. And also, in the moment, what's most imperative is that I take the opportunity to acknowledge, to be accountable, to bring into space the honor that's necessary to create a welcoming environment, right? We all mess up, but that's where we have to take accountability for ourselves, Raven says. Beautiful, right? Yes. I love that. Accountability is Sharita's new jam. Yes, right? So we have to, yeah, it's a growing process, Tanya. We want to work on giving ourselves grace. And then last but certainly not least, we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge, right? It definitely evokes some of the teachings from people like Kimberly Crenshaw or the beautiful words of James Baldwin, right? That not all things can be challenged, but nothing can be challenged until it's acknowledged. We have to lean into a space where we can bring things to the table and challenge it. And so I don't have an attribute to to the quote. And I always tell people this, and it makes me laugh too. When I Google who said it, Google always tells me Dr. Phil said it. I feel like I pulled it out of a video of Kimberly Crenshaw speaking. However, perhaps it was Dr. Phil. So attributable to whom the sentiments to many. So yeah, we cannot challenge, we cannot acknowledge, right? Perhaps Dr. Phil said it. I never heard it, but it's very possible. The sentiment is there. Yeah. Awesome. All right. I want to take an opportunity to honor and acknowledge the Dr. Phil. Jeff is great. We want to take an opportunity to honor a room of expertise. That is so beautiful, Michelle. Thank you. And so this will be, I know it's a long 3-hour session we're spending together, but this is a sharing space. It's about mutual learning. It's about an honoring focused conversation. And when we really lean into the truth of equity, we'll talk a little bit about how we define equity in this session today, but when we lean into it, equity is about making sure that there's space for sharing, for mutual learning, for appreciation of what people bring to the conversation. So we started off, we kicked off with our equity-centered trauma-informed best practices. Thank you to folks who shared in the chat ones that stood out to you or asked questions about ones that you had. And so I love that. Yes, I see the Q&A here. Let's see. Looks like things are so far answered. Suki will let me know if I miss anything. So now let's go into the next part of what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about a culture of authenticity. Let's begin with taking an ecological perspective. Many of you might be familiar with an ecological systems model, or sometimes a lot of folks will talk about like person-centered, person and environment, right? Thank you, Denise. And I like to start with the definition of ecology because I've been talking about the ecological systems model and ecological systems perspective for a long time as part of my profession. But when I sat back and said, what is an ecology? I got really excited about the definition. And that is, an ecology is a branch of science that is concerned with the interrelations of organisms in their environment. And so I read that and said, oh, people and places, understood, right? Family systems, ecological, right, Frankie? Understood. It is the totality of patterns and relations between those organisms and their environment. So it's not just they're interrelated, but it's about the patterns that are happening between people and environment, the levels and layers of people and environments. Okay, I like that. I like that. And then the last part of the definition, this is about just put in chat. It's an often delicate or intricate system that's complex. We are delicate. We are intricate. We are complex. And in order to really understand a holistic and healing center approach, we have to be able to acknowledge that the experiences, the stories, and the histories of the people who we're serving and working with, as well as ourselves, are delicate, intricate, and complex. Yeah. So we're looking at people and environment. So let's do a little data. Let's talk a little data. Okay, so McKinsey and Company did this study, and they started it they started collecting data in 2014, and they concluded the research. They produced the publication in 2022. That's a really interesting time frame to be studying the impact of diversity in the workforce. The reason why I particularly like to uplift this research is because it is a huge data set. They looked at thousands of organizations across multiple countries, got a lot of information. What did they find? Something that I'm sure doesn't surprise many of us is that companies that leaned into diversity and uplifted diversity, invested in diversity, outperformed others. Diversity was, enhanced the organization. Not necessarily too surprising for us in the room, because I think many of us are aware that diversity plays a really important role. It's not just in financial, right? We know that when we really intentionally diversify, what we begin to see is better outcomes in terms of innovation, better outcomes in terms of programming, right? And diversity just adds so much value into our organizations. And so it makes sense to me that when I typically go and I talk to people about equity and enhancing equity and healing-centered practices, people talk to me about diversification. They say, hey, Ashley, I want to diversify our workforce. I want to diversify the people we're serving. I want to diversify my team. And then ultimately, I want to lean into inclusion. I want to make sure all of those people feel included and can participate. And ultimately, we have a goal of becoming an equitable organization. And this trajectory makes sense to me. And in fact, I know we have many different ways that we engage the acronym, but if we really went into the pattern of how people address it, it would really probably be diversity, inclusion, and equity. But that acronym doesn't land us well, right? So we talk about DEI, talk about JEDEIA. And so it's really important to begin to break down what these terms mean and how they function differently. Now, I'm going to pose a question to the group, and I would love for you to answer in the chat. Monroe. What might be an unintended consequence of starting with diversity, acknowledging that diversity is essential and adds great value? What might be an unintended consequence of starting with diversity before acknowledging equity? What might be an unintended consequence of starting with diversity before equity is considered, right? Okay, so I see some folks saying, some folks might not know that they need to change. Tokenism, right? The groundwork hasn't been laid. Absolutely. It might be offensive to some people. Superficial. Root causes are being ignored. Oh my goodness, yes. Skewed view of what's actually happening. Ooh, y'all, hello everyone. This makes me so excited. Assumptions and biases. Yeah, not feeling that people need to change, defensiveness, lack of knowledge and balances. I'm gonna slow down because I know that I know that I could talk for pretty quickly. Biases, insensitivity, and stereotypes. So yes, this is what happened. The outcome of diversity was great because diversity enhances systems. But what ended up happening, and I think the most interesting part of the research and the data for me, was that the experience around inclusion was the opposite. Oh, Jeanette, right? Repeat cycles of what's wrong in the system. The experience around inclusion was the opposite because diversity and inclusion aren't synonyms. They don't mean the same thing. They don't imply the same thing. And they don't express the same thing. And so people were, yes, diversified, but they didn't have an opportunity to contribute meaningfully. That amazing diversity of experiences, of knowledge, of expertise that was present didn't have a space to show up. And so I want to lean into a conversation about inclusivity and authenticity and take a moment here to honor. If an environment feels threatening, we'll tend to conform in order to achieve a sense of safety and protection. Leaders who are willing to take this on benefit from more innovative conversations, greater organizational learnings, employees feeling confident and engaged because they're bringing their true selves to the workplace. I love this quote. And as much as I love our personalities showing up in the workplace, I also want to center and ground us and root in the reality that when we're talking about people conforming, not talk about tossing out some parts of our personality, which we shouldn't do as well. We're talking about people who are literally shifting and changing the way that they're standing or posturing their bodies in order to avoid hateful, hurtful, homophobic comments, transphobic comments. We're talking about people changing physical aspects of their appearance or their voice or their tone to avoid racist comments. People are not using their home language or communicating in their home languages because of misinterpreted, unbiased perceptions and environments that are assumptive and can cause challenges for people communicating, being accused of things that they didn't say. You see people who are not expressing their request for accommodations that could help us in our work because of the known stereotypes and stigmas that are associated with disabilities that could influence our abilities to have a higher level of earning or growth within the organization. People not acknowledging their land, right? Not showing parts of their identity, their religious, ethnic identity, in fear of how people will respond, because we have to be in multiple places in a different way. Someone once referred to as, she expressed, and I want to honor her, that she felt like she had to put on different masks based on who she was talking to in order to feel safe in the environment. And I want to honor that many folks do this each and every day. People are literally conforming to feel safe. Yeah. Alicia puts in the chat the assumption that a group of people, community, has the same thoughts and feelings about issues. People not sharing their lived experience that could be helpful to the system as a whole, Sharon. Yeah, what other things do you all see that people are hiding or changing or shifting to conform for safety? We are not monoliths, Mrs. Malcolm. We do live in a world where this happens, and people are doing this every single day. I also love this quote that says, when our bodies and minds experience safety. So on the other side of that, when we experience safety, our social engagement systems enable us to collaborate, to listen, to empathize, to connect, to be creative, to be innovative, to be bold in our thinking and our ideas. And this has positive benefits for our relationships as our lives in general. Just uplifts. Returning citizens have to confirm a new community, so to speak. Yeah. Mhm. What would it look like if in the places and spaces that you work and in the work that you do, people could collaborate, be creative and innovative and bold? How would that transform the work that you're doing? Question it. It's beautiful. Mhm. Yeah. More effective. Voices would be heard. Less fear. People would be more fierce. Yeah. Overwhelmingly free. Families would win. Transformation. Better flow of ideas. Ooh, being able to visibly see the relief on people. I feel that people can breathe. Energizing. Voice and choice. Oh, safe confidence. Yeah. It will be a positive space. So we're going to spend some time thinking about what is our role in seeing this come to fruition. So good. We wouldn't be so siloed in small communities, acknowledging and honoring the important role geography plays in this, the types of communities we're serving. Beautiful. Yeah. A focus will shift from the systems to affirming families, modeling for future generations. It's so good. Authenticity, I love it. And so one of the things that I think stands out to me from the suggestions of this is that we want to ensure representation of diverse talent. We want to strengthen leadership, accountability, and capability for inclusion and diversity. We want to enable equality of opportunity through fairness and transparency. We want to promote an openness and tackle microaggressions, which I'm going to spend some time with microaggressions today. I know many of us are familiar with it. I want to talk about a little different today. And foster belongingness through unequivocal support for multivariate diversity. I like these suggestions, and I like these suggestions a lot. But I will say that oftentimes, even when presenting this, people are left with some critical questions like how? These are great things that I want to do, but how? What are the next steps? And I think that we're in a space where many of us have been having the conversation more. We feel more prepared than ever before to have the conversation. And we're in a space to really assess, is this something that we're able to do? So we talked about equity-centered, trauma-informed practices, just to recap and to reground us. We talked about equity-centered identity, conversational best practices. We talked about a culture of authenticity. And now we're going to talk about the essential role of equity. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge a few questions. How can we frame our responsibility to show up authentically and challenge systems against the system's responsibility to change? Right? And this is, I think, a beautiful question that Robert brings to the group that begins to look at the multi-layerness of it. We're going to be talking about culture change. And in a minute, we're going to talk about how equity isn't an additive. It's not something we sprinkle on top, right? It's a whole system, whole culture change. And so things are happening simultaneously where we are taking accountability to promote an environment where people can show up authentically while simultaneously changing the inherent culture that restricts people from being able to show up authentically. And so developing a plan, a strategy to be able to do that is going to be important so that people can do it safely. Most importantly, I think when I lean into this question about, how do we actually do this? When the culture change, as the data shows, it speaks for itself. And the benefit of it is a benefit to all. And so as a result, organizations that may have been reluctant to change are often more open to change when it starts to happen organically through people creating that type of environment through our own individual active action. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm grateful for the question. So let's talk about the central role of equity. So I developed a framework. It's more so it's more so a reframe. And it talks about starting with equity first. It's called the Equity First Framework. And so when I go in, I talk about what are the gaps that exist and persist. What are the processes, the procedures, the cultural elements of an organization that need to begin to change? What do we need to understand about the communities that we're serving, the families and the children and their real experiences that they're having within our society, as well as the staff and people in our community who are serving them? And get to acknowledging that difficult space to close those gaps so that we have an equitable environment that will inherently be inclusive because we have looked at those gaps. And so a lot of times people will juxtapose equality and equity. And I love this because even when I'm presenting, some folks will tell me, I like the term equality more than equity. And some folks will say, I like the term equity more than equality. And I think it's important to acknowledge, as Laura put in the chat, that they're not the same thing, right? And so equality is one goal of everyone being able to experience or have the same. And the way that we go about getting to equality is leaning into equity, because we can't have everyone can't experience the same when there are these huge gaps that exist and persist. So equity looks at what are the disparities, where are the inequities, where are the historical and contemporary events or cultural nuances that are prohibiting people from even beginning to think about what it would look like if everyone were to access the same. And so while I think that people who advocate for equality and people who advocate for equity are really looking at the same thing of reducing harm and ensuring that people can thrive, starting with equity means starting with the work that has to be done to ensure that that's even possible. Yeah, Donna puts in chat, sameness is not the same as fairness. They're very different practices. So we start with equity and we create an inclusive environment so that the diverse folks who are already there and who will continue to come will be able to have the impact that they're making be sustained and valued and meritorious and acknowledged, and that we can be able to see the families and the communities and the young folk who we're serving for the wholeness of their experience, the intersectionalities of their experience. Thank you so much. Yeah. Also, a resource was shared in the resource section that kind of has some thought prompts for you all. I would encourage, if to download it afterwards or to have it later, just to take some notes. And it helps. The resource that was just shared is going to help you think about what things you can do to start to implement some of the things that we're talking about today. And they go along with our section headings. So I just wanted to name that because I saw it pop up on my screen. Yeah, Bex. Yeah, that picture that resonates with a lot of people. Equality, everyone being given the same, and equity being people given what they need to be able to participate. Yeah. So I posed to this group. I posed it to us earlier. What will be the benefit of an environment where people could be bold, creative, and innovative? And you all respond to that. But I also ask us, and your answer might be to do it yourself, to show up yourself. But what is our role in creating an environment where people can show up as ourselves? What is our role? Meeting people where they are, welcoming folks. Being authentic and transparent, asking questions, supporting safety, being open, listening without bias or judgment, empathy, acknowledging differences, not ignoring them, demonstrating compassion. Yeah. Asking people, that inquisition I'm going to lead to is centering humanity, not assuming. Listening not to respond, just listening. And listening in a way, or engaging in a way that people have access to, right? That's something I want to bring into the space. We can talk about accessing. Sometimes we'll say, this person can't do something. This person can't, engage in this conversation, particularly from an accessibility lens. This person can't. No, maybe there's an access issue. And we need to address that first and foremost. Respecting families as the experts on their family. That's great. That's great. As you all are typing in the chat, regrounding ourselves. Best practices, engaging in a culture of authenticity, acknowledging the essential role of equity. And now we're going to go into a conversation around stress and trauma responses. I'm going to pause here before we kind of pivot the content to see if there's any questions. No.
Yes, there's a couple.
Like they're all answered at this point. Great.
I think there's a couple questions in the chat, Dr. Stewart.
Perfect. In the chat or QA?
In the QA, sorry. I can read them if you like.
Yeah, please.
Okay, the first one is, how are we balancing respecting people's beliefs, experiences, etc., when it directly conflicts with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, that's a great one. How are we balancing respecting people's beliefs and experiences when it directly conflicts with diversity, equity, and inclusion? I am grateful that this work has taught me about how to have the conversation more than anything else. And it's taken a lot of time of advocacy and feeling really passionately about a bunch of different topics to understand what are some of the most strategic, but most importantly, healing-centered ways to even have the conversation. And I noticed that whenever I met with apprehension, when I met with conflict, when I'm met with disbelief, or when someone's belief systems are immediately mitigating or minimizing the equity and inclusion of other folks, it's often rooted in people's lived experiences as well. And we're getting ready to talk about stress and trauma responses, so I think it's such an appropriately typed question. And the resistance that can be created divides the conversation even more. For example, if we're talking about an issue, a structural systemic issue, and we begin to debate someone else's humanity, we're already at a place where we're not able to have a productive conversation. And so I'll sit back and I'll understand, I'll create a space to listen and not respond, to maybe develop an appreciation for what is that emotional barrier, what is that traumatic response that is inevitably showing up, that's creating such a resistance to someone else being able to show up as their authentic self. And oftentimes I find that it has to do with something that someone experienced. We're talking about the experience of families. A lot of times it's connected, deeply rooted to familial experiences that people have had. And we'll talk a little bit later about like cues and being activated in conversations. When that tends to happen, we start to think about specific people. And so instead of rushing into, you need to understand this, why, if it's our role or our capacity to, if we're choosing to engage or move meaningful conversations forward as part of our work, then the most important thing we can do is to pause and to level set, to get back to a place where we can even engage in that conversation. Now, for some of us, these beliefs or direct conflicts are coming as a result of our own identities. And so I say this as someone whose goal or my work is specifically about having the difficult conversation, but I also want to acknowledge that for some folks, when that happens, that can create harm for us as well. And being able to do what we need to be safe in that moment is absolutely paramount. But if we're asking it in terms of how do we engage with those folks meaningfully, you'll see later we'll talk about like pausing for the wound. We'll talk about different strategies to engage. But ultimately, that conversation has now begun to focus on something else, and it might need a refocusing. I see another question. With so many rules to follow to support our families, how can we make changes to support them and stay within the lines of the organization we work for to set for professionals to follow? And I think every organization is going to be different, right? And organizations are going to be at different stages in moving towards being healing centered. When it comes to showing support in as we get into the sectional trauma informed, you'll see that this is more so about engaging in a space from inquisition, being willing to ask questions and reduce our assumptions to have meaningful impact. And so in a lot of ways, when we get to the space of these changes, it might be that we need to change a policy and a procedure and a practice. And I support organizations in doing that as well. And in some instances, what we're really seeing is an opportunity to inquire more, to ask more questions. And so in a lot of ways, when we get to inquire more. So let's look at some examples of that. Yeah. Listen with your heart. Yeah, I love that. So I like to introduce, and I see more questions. We're going to definitely get to those as well. Thinking about trauma. I love to use this example. See my beautiful lion friend here on the screen. I always ask folks, if for some reason there was a lion in the room that you were in, what would you do? If I were somehow there and I see you and I'm like, what? There's a lion in your room, Carrie. What would you do? People say run, leave, find a new room, freeze, approach it slowly. Hey, kitty, kitty. Keep an eye on it. It's still in prey. Try to pet it. Question it. Yeah, avoid eye contact. That's so funny. One time I did actually twice I've done this now. Someone has actually like worked or had a family member who worked with like live lions and gave me really specific instructions. I was so amused that they had a real answer for me that I didn't take notes. So I don't know what to tell you all to do in a real life situation. But I love these examples that are coming up in the chat. So just to highlight a few for folks, because I know it's moving fast. So was to throw a steak, run slowly. So it's just going to fall right on out. Not panic. Bring it to everyone's attention. You're gonna sit down with the lion and talk. I love all the pennant responses, right? But I see give it my lunch. Yeah, Jason said give it my lunch. I love that. Natasha said run faster than my spouse. Denise, see, that's what the line came in looking like. Denise put a GIF in the chat. Clearly we're thinking about it. We're seeing the different response, like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so as we have, and you'll see I have flop there, and I'll talk about why. But as we have this conversation about trauma, I also want to acknowledge and kind of put it out there that some of us, our roles in our jobs are to diagnose and help people heal through trauma. That is some folks in this room's actual job and role. What I'm describing here is looking at stress responses, looking at trauma responses, and creating a space where we acknowledge that we don't know. This is about leading with inquisition, not diagnosing or not treating or not supporting people through their trauma, but using an informed lens to navigate through difficult situations. And so, yes, we saw lots of fight responses, right? So some folks say throwing things, throw a shoe at it. We see our flight responses, folks are running or walking away slowly. Some folks are saying freeze. Some folks are offering lunch. We see that fawning response by offering things, appeasing the threat. And then, of course, I think we are just trying to stay in the themes of F. And one of the ones that folks are talking about more lately is like flop, which is where you just really become unable to respond in any way. Different than freeze. Freeze is intentional decision that people are making, whereas a flop response would be more like unable to do any type of a response to. And I don't, I think we're just trying to stay with the F words. I think there's a lot of other words that would better describe what we're trying to communicate with the flop response. So I put it in the brackets because I don't always use that because I feel like it's more connotated than the others. But, it's definitely something that we're seeing or that people experiences. Mm-hmm. So because we're not talking about trauma, we're talking about stress responses and trauma responses and how people are showing up to different situations that may or may not be connected to something else. I like to think about what this could look like in everyday experiences. So I'm just going to take a few because we're a really big group. But when it comes to folks who we're partnering with or people who you're serving or people who you're providing services to, what are some of the ways that folks are described that might likely fall under a fight response? So I'll give an example. Oh, Beverly gave an example for us. They don't reach out for help. They're defensive, Lydia says. They're aggressive. They're oppositional. They're guarded, right? And so maybe we're working with people and that's the sentiment that's coming up about them. They're guarded, they're argumentative, they're judgmental. Maybe there's a stress response happening. Maybe there's a trauma response happening. And it could give us an opportunity to engage differently. Again, not here to diagnose, not here to support people through their trauma. It's just giving us a lens to be informed that says, I don't know what this is. But perhaps when I hear defiant be used, when I hear this person self-isolating, it's an opportunity to lean in differently and say, maybe this is a response to something greater. Maybe this is a response to something inequitable that they are experiencing. All right, let's use a freeze response. What are some of the things that you might see people say about folks who might be exhibiting a freeze stress response? Helpless. They're ignoring the problem. They're procrastinating. No one put that, but I put that. That's me typing in the chat. They don't care. They're uncooperative. They're withdrawn. They're lacking motivation. They're saying, I can't. They're unmotivated. They're numb. Right? Again, giving us an opportunity to say, this person seems like they're avoiding this conversation. Maybe this is the opportunity to say, what could be being activated? I'm going to pause here for a second because I keep using the word activated. I want to acknowledge that when I'm using the term activated, I'm using it in the same way that many people would use the word triggered. I do a lot of gun violence work, and so I do not use the word triggered to talk about when something happens that is like evokes something for someone. So I use the term activated, and I use it similarly, if not identically, to how people use the word triggered. So I wanted to name that and say that because you'll hear me say activated a lot in the next couple slides.
Dr. Stewart, I wanted to hop in because we have a related question in the Q&A, I think, to just what you were talking about the difference between being triggered or activated. And so Patricia has asked you, in the workplace, how do you discern harm, meaning like as a trauma response versus discomfort, such as due to fragility?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let me look at the question. Sometimes it helps me process to see it. So how do we discern harm as a trauma response versus discomfort, right? And so I love this question, Patricia, because it's nuanced. And with a little later, we're going to talk about our comfort zones. And this is work for all of us as part of that first slide. There's going to inevitably be the work for us to do to say, okay, when I'm getting discomfort, am I removing myself or disengaging because I have the privilege and ability to disengage from the conversation? And is it possible that someone's discomfort in itself, or even that fragility in itself, is a defense mechanism or a protective mechanism or a trauma response? And I think that when we lean into it and say, even if we're seeing discomfort and we believe or we're experiencing, or that person even acknowledges that it's coming up as a mode of fragility, that in itself is something to talk about. That in itself is something to lean into, right? Why do we feel like it's okay, or that it's the most ideal solution to disengage because I'm feeling fragile? What are we afraid is going to happen by leaning into this conversation? And I think that sometimes when we're like, that's the fragility that's happening, then that displaces it over. That needs to be addressed too. There needs to be a safe space where we can say fragility is a barrier to us being able to have the conversations and make the meaningful culture change that we need. So we need to bring it there. So what is it? Where is the root of it? How do we engage with it? What is a strategy we can develop to address it? And in that way, that level of inquisition helps us discern, is this harm? Is this a trauma response? Is this fragility that could be rooted in something that is a stress response to someone else? Or is this something that someone's just enabling or enacting a level of privilege to disengage from it? Either way, we want to use that same inquisition to bring it to the forefront of the conversation. It's a great question. These are all really great questions. I also see a question to describe flop again. Flop as opposed, because fight, freeze, or fawn are more common. The flop is like, I've heard it even be described as like someone just falls out, like literally fainting, like just unable to respond as a flop response, which again, a little different than freeze, which people are doing it to remain still or to as a protective mechanism. Okay. How do we invoke trauma-informed care first to employees, management, organizations? Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we'll leave it as unanswered, Michelle, but we'll come back to it. I think it's also important here to define trauma. And again, in our role of this being a tool for us to lean in inquisition as we look at like organizational change, I like to acknowledge that trauma, adversity, and chronic stress are universal to the human experience. A lot of times we'll describe trauma as the event, right? And as you see in this definition, trauma is the result of an event, a series of events or circumstances that an individual experiences. And so two people could experience the same thing as processed in one person's body as trauma or stress and not in the other person's, because there's so many aspects and variables that can influence how it's impacting someone. Someone might have experienced so much that there's now a different sensation that they experience when they're confronted with the threat because of a long-term exposure. So trauma is the result of the event, not the event itself. And I think that's a really important distinction that's needing to be made when we're talking about being informed and thoughtful about how we engage with folks. Mm-hmm. Trauma can absolutely change the brain chemistry. Yep. Great point, Carrie. Yeah. Patricia puts a great definition of flop in the chat too. Yeah. again, in looking at the definition, so Patricia puts a chat, in a definition in chat that talks about people whose experiences of being or expecting or needing someone to respond to them, to care for them. Again, another reason why I don't always include flop. I think we're still really talking about what this response looks like. And I think it's important that we continue to destigmatize what that response looks like. So that's why I put it in my little brackets there, because it's important to talk about. But I think that there's still some more processing as to what that looks like in people's bodies. Because all of these are responses to a threat. And so there's something in that response around nurturance that we need to uplift and honor. All right. Moving along here, we have equity-centered trauma-informed practices. We have a culture of authenticity is essential. We're talking about the essential role of equity in the conversation, the equity first framework. And we just talked about stress and trauma responses. How are folks feeling? Just checking in with you all. Good, amazing, great, okay. Excited. Yes, I saw someone emphasizing that trauma is not the event. Okay, informed. Next, we're going to talk about truth, trust, and trauma. And so we're going to start to talk about strategies to lean into it. And I think that for me, talking about strategies is also a really important and critical part to talk about the intersections of identities and how identities play a role in trauma. Well, Tamika, I mean, definitely many of us can relate to that. So honoring that you're juggling multiple things. So when I say systemic oppression, we're talking about systems that oppress people. Okay, so what are some systems that you all observe through your work that oppress people? What are some of the systems that we might be referring to when we say systemic oppression? Welfare system, criminal justice, banking, education, criminal. Ooh, I think I saw one I haven't seen before. Pay, all of them, all of them. Healthcare, insurance, schools, banking, justice. All right, I think we get to the point where we're like, yes, all of them. Which ones do we not see it in? And so, yeah, we see this in a lot of different systems. Sorry, y'all, just making sure I can see your chat comments here. Okay, perfect. Everywhere, right? And so, as we think about this, that there is multi-level compounding, let's talk about different types of identity-centered trauma. And I love to do this because I think it grounds us. It also honors that while trauma and stress are universal, central to the human experience, there's also different ways that identity groups can experience above and beyond really nuanced and specific types of trauma. And so we're going to bring in it. Well, I appreciate you said you don't understand how the trauma is not the event, right? So I'm going to pause there because I think that that's important to acknowledge. So you and I or two people could go through the same event and it be processed in one person's body as it produces the experience of trauma in one person and not the other, right? That could be based on a multitude of different variables, support systems, that could be based on if it's happened before, it could be based on the environment, it could be based on time because it could be initially processed or experienced as traumatic in my body, but maybe it takes time for it to be processed in someone else's. And so we don't want to get into defining things to say, you experienced this, therefore you have trauma. Instead, we want to lean into and say, multiple people can experience the same thing and it can be processed in people's bodies differently. Yeah, genetic makeup can play a role in it. Yeah. So I start with race-based traumatic stress, and I love to honor and uplift the scholarship that focuses on the experiences of racial trauma. Racial trauma is a more severe form of race-based traumatic stress. Trauma is described as the experiences or situations that lead to an emotion that are emotionally painful and distressing that overwhelm a person's ability to cope. So going back to that same thing, some people might not feel overwhelmed or experience it as emotionally painful that impact their ability to cope based on what the particular event is. But it is trauma when that experience does cause that in the body. And so being physically attacked or exposed to a hate crime are things that are potentially traumatic events. Race-based traumatic stress is a consequence to the ongoing racial stressors. So there's some aspect of it that are vicarious too. So it could happen to you. You could see it happen to someone else. You can observe it happening across the world. There is a unique experience that comes along with living as a person with a structurally, systemically marginalized racial identity group. And one of the things I think is important to uplift as we talk about race-based traumatic stress is the scholars like Robert Carter, who developed our measures and the concept of race-based traumatic stress, were very cautious not to pathologize the individual. They were very cautious not to look solely at the way that it presents in people, but instead to look at the systems that we're perpetuating as part of it. Yes. Marina, I'm gonna come to that. Yeah, thanks for bringing that to space. I see it, and I'm going to make sure to talk about it. Yeah. And so I see that in the chat, someone shared that they call it racism or racial trauma or racism-based traumatic stress. And that's really what Robert Carter, in defining race-related stress or race-based stress, was getting at, is that it's really looking at the racism that's perpetuating the harm onto people, rather than solely focusing on how that's experienced in the body. I like to uplift insidious trauma, and I like to uplift and acknowledge the LGBTQ scholars that really lean into insidious trauma. We have a lot of accessibility scholars and people with lived expertise that lean into the scholarship around insidious trauma, as well as communities of color as well. You'll see insidious trauma show up here too. Insidious trauma refers to ongoing negative experiences being a member of an oppressed group. So some of you are probably picking up on some of the language that people are putting into the chat too, like racism based or systemically oppressed or excluded. All of this language is being really intentional to demonstrate that something is happening to people. So people are not marginal. They are being marginalized by a system, a structure, a community, a family, whatever, that people are being marginalized. People aren't minorities in the sense that they might be a global majority, but their experiences are being minoritized by us, by similarly. So insidious trauma refers to, it is expansive to experiences with oppression more broadly. And again, and even before we start to see the conversation emerge in race-based traumatic stress, goes to depathologize and to destigmatize people who have experiences with PTSD. The symptoms mirror that of PTSD. I also love to uplift historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and intergenerational trauma, recognizing that those are different terms. And historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, a lot of the amazing research that comes here honors and acknowledges Native, Indigenous, and tribal scholars and lived expertise. trafficking, as well as labor trafficking, human trafficking. You'll see a lot in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as religious and religious ethnic scholarships. You have a lot of that contributes to the work looking at the Holocaust. And so racial trauma, a key feature of the historical trauma, is the psychological and emotional consequences of trauma being experienced that are transmitted generation to generation. Now, this is in circumstances, this is through the physical environment. This is through the environmental aspect of it, the physiological, the narratives that are shared. Epigenetic studies are also showing the impact of this through individuals. So what are the physical stress responses? What are the neurochemical impact of this? Sorry, I was just making sure I didn't have another question. I saw someone come up on screen. What are the epigenetic consequences of this? So how are we seeing this be translated from generation to generation? Oh yeah. Up to and in different ways. I love, like Angela brings into, up to 3 generations can be impacted, and even looking beyond 3 generations, right? How are the ecosystems of people's experiences extending even beyond that? Generational trauma is so real. I also like to uplift occultative stress, and we don't really talk about it in terms of occultative trauma, but the stress of this absolutely reaches the levels of which it could be experienced as trauma in people's bodies. So occultative stress, I like to uplift and acknowledge immigrant and refugee scholarship and folks who are talking about those experiences. We're also looking at people who are being oppressed through language, as I'll discuss in a moment. So cultural stress is the adaptation to a new culture. Now, some of that could be looking at like the cultural norms between different places and spaces that folks occupy. But this is also projected onto folks through discrimination, language barriers, right? So maybe you have the like parentification or the adultification of children of immigrant families because we don't have very strong translation services or resources available. And while children are happily and willingly able to help their families navigate through really complex systems, it also has an emotional toll, having to be that liaison because our organizations aren't prepared or ready to really support the multiple different languages or cultures that people show up and come with and bring a value into our spaces. And so that discrimination, language barriers, as well as unfair policies and procedures related to documentation status and immigration status, all can create compounded stress responses and trauma responses in folks. I love all that's being shared in the chat. Yeah. Dakota culture teaches that trauma will be felt through the 7th generation. Yep, it's definitely beyond. Yeah. Adam's requesting information about the epigenetic and the biological components of historical trauma. I will be working with the team to send something following, and I'll remember to include something there. So I'll present on these topics and I'll talk about the importance of identity-centered trauma. And a lot of times folks will say, we talk about how this is unique to uniquely impacting communities and communities that we would describe as communities of color. And there are a lot of scholars like Dr. Joy DeCroix and Resma Minikin who talk about, and as you'll see here, Haig, who talk about what this uniquely could look like for white and white identified folk as well. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting and important to name in a space where we're talking about trauma responses is that Haig looks at the isolation, the systematizing, and the isolating that can occur for white and white identified folks. And it's really described as more of like a cognitive dissonance. So being a child who is observing maybe violent crimes towards communities of color, or observing inequities, biases, hate crimes, etc., that are related to people specifically around parts of their identity period, right? So that could relate to all people, seeing people be growing up and seeing someone, a trans person, be attacked. One of the ways that the scholars are describing is that people have to then be able to do a cognitive shift, a cognitive dissonance, to be able to proceed. And one of the ways that we do that is to say, well, what happened, and try to provide a context around it that creates a sense of explanation. And that in itself being described as a trauma response that needs to be addressed and responded to in order to ensure that we can move forward with equity. And so instead of asking, well, what did this person do, or what was the context, really creating a humanistic approach to say that people should not experience violence, that violence should not happen, and healing the wounds of being able to observing that, or feeling connected to, or complicit, or aligned with cultures that this shows up in. And so Haig really does a nice job at talking about what this has looked like for therapeutic interventions. And Haig, as identifies as a white person, talks about what that looks like in practice, is a really important part of the trauma work. Oh yeah, Bex, honoring that. Dave brings into the chat, using a family member or child for translation can be very, very problematic. Yeah. So this brings us to another place of settling. Maybe even as we have this conversation, looking through identity-centered forms of trauma, we might be feeling this in our bodies. So quick bio quiz. What are some of the systems in our bodies? What are some of the systems in our bodies? Digestive, endocrine, muscular, neurological, respiratory, skeletal, GI, brain, nervous, parasympathetic, circulatory, lymphatic, immunological. Someone's going to give me one that I don't know how to pronounce, and I'm always prepared for that. Fortunately, they're going so fast that if there's one that I really can't pronounce, no one will know. Right? We have all these systems in our bodies as well.
Dr. Stewart, were you referring
to oppression not only is experienced through people through the systems that we talked about earlier, but is impacted in our bodies systemically. When research studies show that when people experience discrimination, similar parts of their brain light up as if they were physically assaulted. We acknowledge and honor that oppression is experienced systemically. Even as we have this conversation here today, someone brings us chakras, right? Even as we have this conversation here today, we might be feeling it in our bodies. And that's from us having this conversation for about an hour and a half so far today. So the long-term impact of feeling things in our bodies is important to bring up and to engage with and to acknowledge.
Dr. Stewart?
Yes.
I think it would be great if we could take about a 10-minute break.
Absolutely.
This is a good time to stop. I was just thinking, you were talking about how we're feeling things in our bodies, and I think a lot of the folks in the chat are feeling the need to stretch their legs for a little bit. So I think we're going to take about a 10-minute break, and we will start sharply at 5 after the top of the hour, in whatever time zone that is. And also, I just wanted to acknowledge, we see many, many questions in the Q&A, and a lot of those are similar. And so this little break will give us a chance to make sure that we're addressing all those questions and that we can stay caught up with y'all. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back. We are going to start promptly at 5 after the hour. And if you have not downloaded or accessed the implementation guide, please navigate to the resources tab, and you can click on the access here button in the broadcast that's happening now. And then there's a little menu with 3 dots that you can click on and download it that way, or click on view. And we'll put further instructions if needed in the chat. Thank you all. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Stewart.
Thank you so much. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Got snacks. Got a good stretch. Got to sit in some peace for a moment. Tea and snacks. I love that for you. Happy to be back. I'm happy to be back too. Hello. Awesome. Oh, chocolate sounds great. Done. I'm gonna have to treat myself after. DJ, you ready? Me too. I love it. Breaks are good. Yes. That's beautiful. Some of you were able to do a whole lot in that 10 minutes. I'm very impressed. All right. So we're gonna flood the chat a little bit, and that's fine. But I want to first check and see, we're gonna do a little measure here. Do folks feel like, put an exclamation point in the chat if you feel like you're very, very familiar with the term microaggressions? I love it. Okay, I see a lot of exclamation points coming in. I'm gonna give it some time in case there's any delays. Great question. I said, put an exclamation point in the chat if you feel like you're very familiar with the term microaggressions. Okay. Put an @ symbol in the chat if you're like, a little bit. I see ats, I see X's. I'm gonna take the X's. Yes, you can use any symbol you want. Yeah. Okay. So a lot, right? And then we maybe even have some folks who are like, I do not know what that word means at all. Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions today. If we were a smaller group, I would ask people to, oh, Angela, I love that. Let's talk about it. If we were a smaller group, I would ask people to Google or search in any capacity. If you have a physical dictionary, I would ask you to open it to identify what exactly a microaggression is. And based on algorithms, you all would have different definitions show up as your first or second definition. Yes, we'll actually have it on the screen in just a moment too. You'd get different definitions of microaggressions. So I pulled together a couple of the ones that show up most often according to people's algorithms. If you're searching it up now, you might come up with a slightly different definition. It's likely some variation of a statement, action, or incident that's regarded as an indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. Emily puts a definition in the chat for us. Microaggressions are common everyday slights and comments that relate to various aspects of one's appearance or identity, such as class, gender, sex, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, mother tongue, age, body shape, disability, or religion. That is a newer definition that comes up on So thank you, Emily, for providing that definition. We can even spotlight Emily's definition just for a moment too. Microaggression is a term used for commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized group. Yeah, we're going to talk about it. I see folks talk about macroaggressions and micro, or yeah, we're going to talk about it. That's good. I love that people are putting it. A comment or action that subtly, unconsciously, or unintentionally expresses an attitude towards members of a marginalized group. So these are common definitions of microaggressions. What are some of the words that stand out to you from these definitions before we dive into it a little bit more deeply? Unintentional. Yes, someone put in the chat, never heard from the definition Emily provided, mother tongue, people's native and languages, people's indigenous language. Mm-hmm. Negative, stigmatized, prejudice, subtly, derogatory, stigmatized, discrimination, unintentional, indirect, unintentional, indirect. You're putting into the chat words from these definitions that stand out to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unconscious, hostile, implicit. Mm-hmm. So, commonplace, yeah. So these definitions of microaggressions are probably some of the more pervasive definitions of microaggressions. They come, maybe some of us remember when there were the different collegiate campaigns where students were talking about their experiences with microaggressions on campuses, really at that point catapulting the literature around microaggressions. And in 2007, there was a taxonomy of microaggressions, which I even think I saw someone put into the chat. So the taxonomy of microaggressions is micro insults, micro assaults, and micro invalidations, developed by Dr. Daryl Wing Sue and colleagues. And I say in colleagues, but they're absolutely leaders in the microaggression literature. Now, I'll give some examples of microaggressions through the taxonomy, which can also help for folks who are like, I've never heard this term before. I'm not used to this term. What does it mean? So the way that we have been talking about microaggressions and is, a micro insult is, oh my goodness, you speak really good English. Now, some of us might have said to people before, you might be like, what's wrong with saying that to someone? It's often in the context of the assumption that you didn't expect someone to be able to articulate themselves, and thereby that bias around that assumption of what you expected of the person is being projected onto the individual. You're so strong for a woman. You're so pretty for a Black girl. These are these backhanded, intended to be a compliment, right? That ultimately end up causing a lot of harm because it's coming from this like insincere place. You throw really well for a girl. You're so pretty for a big girl, right? Some people are putting examples in the chat. Yeah, they're shady. Was up in the chat. So yes, someone calling out your accent. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? These are micro insults. Micro assaults are maybe some things that we're able to see more clearly. Someone's asked to move from their seat. And you're like, why'd they ask them to move? Yeah, I see some more in the chat. You're so articulate. Yeah, yep. Someone not getting money put into their hand or being treated as if they're not touchable, right? Or you go into a restaurant with a group and constantly certain people are being addressed at the top of the restaurant than other folks. Those are the micro assaults, things that we can see very clearly, some things that we can observe or experience. So more than that, but things that we are able to experience or observe through a multitude of different ways. those are examples of micro assaults, right? And if anyone's unfamiliar with the term microaggressions, we're seeing so many examples show up in the chat. Yeah, refusing to hand change to you after you buy a book that identifies a religion. Yes, that's a micro assault. And then a micro invalidation. Micro invalidation is something that mitigates that, right? So I see a beautiful example is, why don't you speak Spanish just because you look Hispanic, right? And then when that is offensive, someone says, "Oh, I know Ashley, she didn't mean it that way. You're taking it too personal. You're not, you're overthinking it." Those micro invalidations show up, and so you're too sensitive. Yeah. So then you start to get those micro invalidations. So this taxonomy that emerges in 2007 gave a lot of critical insight to microaggressions. It also is a point where we're starting to see it move past the term racial microaggressions to microaggressions more broadly, looking at the experiences across intersecting identities. Now, earlier I was saying people were talking about the micro, like what is the micro? This micro is the smallness. I think it's really important to understand the context for microaggressions and where they show up in our literature. So looking at this list of definitions again, I ask, are folks familiar with the original definition of microaggressions, or specifically when it was coined? When did we first see the term microaggression show up in written form? Yeah. So yes, the work has definitely been uplifted, and we see Daryl Wing Su and folks really emphasizing microaggressions. We start to see it popularized 5 or 7 years ago. Karina puts in the chat the 70s. The term microaggression first emerges in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Now, there was a lot going on in the 1960s, 1970s, y'all, right? There's a lot going on in the 1960s, 1970s. Yeah. Yeah, most of us seen it in early 2000s or familiarized with it. Some of us were introduced even recently as we started to talk about it a bit more. But we first see microaggressions show up in 1960s, 1970s. The term microaggression was coined by a Black psychiatrist named Dr. Chester Pierce. And he defined it as the chief vehicle for pro-racist behaviors. It was also defined as subtle, stunning, and automatic non-verbal put-downs and exchanges that are put-downs of Black people. And in the original definition, Black people by white people. That's a very different definition than the one that we talked about. Right? So how does it go from the original definition of chief vehicle for pro-racist behavior to the definitions we saw on the previous screen? So the context that's really important here is there was legislation that was outlawing overt racism in the 1960s, 1970s. So you have the Civil Rights Act that literally prohibited people, civil rights acts that prohibited people from discriminatory behaviors. So I like to describe it as this: people are no longer able to tell someone, you can't sit in my restaurant. However, I will make you so uncomfortable that you won't want to. And we start to see this more covert form. And there's other literature that comes up at this time. You start to see things like institutional racism and critical race theory start to show up in the literature. Yes, I see some more examples of microaggressions coming into the chat. I know there's some delays. Thank you. Yes, continue to put those examples that you all are seeing in your work in the chat. So the term microaggression, certainly, Black 70s is the book that we originally see it in print, in case anyone's interested. the original definition of microaggressions was not intended to describe the smallness of it. So people were like, the micro in it isn't really resonating with me. But it wasn't intended to describe something that was unconsequential or insignificant. And I like to describe it as like a scratch to wound analogy. If I came up to someone and I scratched them, they'd be like, ouch, Ashley, why'd you do that? And they might even, initially resist it. But if it continues on pervasively, day in, day out, without break, for days, months, years, eventually someone might even ask you, like, what's up with that Ashley lady? Why is she scratching you? And your response might be, she's always here. I don't know. I gave up that a long time ago, right? Some of that numbing that we talked about earlier. But just like if I were talking about my actual physical hand here, what would happen to my skin if I continue to scratch it without break, without stopping? Lauren, that's good. Victoria, yep. It would scar. What else might happen? Yep. Without stop. What might happen after the skin breaks? It won't be able to heal. It'll bleed. Infection. It will spread. It would fester. The cumulative damage, the wound. Right? Now it's becoming something else that we have to respond to in a different way. And when people talk about microaggressions, we often talk about it in a way that's so aligned with something like discrimination. The unfortunate thing is that most people experience discrimination at some point in their lives. It's very unfortunate. And also it's important to acknowledge that the ways that we experience discrimination is not always inherently a microaggression. The microaggression describes the repeated recurrentness of these day-to-day encounters that end up overwhelming and impeding a person's ability to cope. Microaggressions are not inconsequential in any way, shape, or form. In fact, they are a leading contributor to pretty significant disparities in health outcomes because that wound doesn't have a chance to heal, Deborah, right? And the wound continues to reopen, Desiree and Valerie. It has trouble healing. So we start to see that the consequence of microaggressions creates this weathering and this allostatic load, referring to the cumulative burden of that stress and those day-to-day life events. And so we want to lean into our understanding of something. I use microaggressions as an example because it's so tangible that as we start to think about specific strategies to use within our organizations to be trauma-informed, that we're recognizing that people are experiencing subtle discrimination, insidious trauma. Their energy is being depleted from having to code switch, which means change the way that you talk or engage in certain circumstances to be more receivable, to have people be more receptive to you. Assimilation, imposter syndrome, and it's consequential to people's overall wellness. So we talked about, just to reground us, best practices for having the conversations, the importance of authenticity. We talked about equity first as a framework. We talked about stress and trauma responses. We talked about truth, trust, and trauma going into the identity-based forms of trauma. And now we're going to talk a little bit about tips, trauma-informed practices, and strategies to be able to create more healing-centered organizations and implement some of these equitable practices into our work. I will pause here, though, because I know that Sugi was helping to put together some of the questions so we may be able to respond. So before we get too far off from the questions that folks posed in the first 5 sections of our time together, I want to take a moment to reflect on any questions.
Yes, thank you. There are several questions, and I have a feeling that you might cover some of this in the next section when we get into practices. But a lot of the questions really center on some of the disparity between staff and management at their organizations for being willing to kind of address diversity, equity, and inclusion, and justice and belonging, if we're really going to be trauma-informed and create healing-centered organizations. And so just if you can speak to, as you go through this next section, or if you want to right now, I think there was about 4 or 5 questions in the Q&A that were asking about that, you know, how do you kind of advocate for yourself in the face of management and or leaders who are not very receptive.
Beautiful. Yes. Perfect. I'm going to go through the next section, and I'm sure that those questions will be resolved, that we might even get even more specificity in those questions. So please, if you submitted that question and you feel like as I go through, you want to even lean into it a bit more, please submit the question again, or we will come back to those to make sure that everything's covered as we go through. So we're going back to this role of inquisition. I first went into the space, the conversation around inquisition, when we were talking about describing trauma earlier, right? And so we want to really lean into what are those practices. And so the first thing I want to lean into is the why behind every measure, the why behind every question, the assumptions as barriers. And so inquisition is something that I constantly come back to as I do this work in supporting organizations that are advancing healing-centered practices. Now, I mentioned earlier that equitable change is an equity is not an additive. It's not something sprinkled on top. It's not a 5-point plan. It's not a small group of people. It's a whole culture, whole system change. So that means we have to look at the solutions or the ways that we even begin to lean in and acquire on that multi-level. So when it comes to serving families and children, the inquisition is, being really thoughtful and strategic about the questions we ask and why. And we say, what's the why behind my question? Am I gathering information that's going to help me serve folks, or am I asking it because I'm interested? And sometimes, y'all, I gotta be honest, I'm asking because I'm interested. Right? And so making sure that I'm always ensuring that the why behind my question is something that helps me understand the circumstance a bit more, as that will be the most healing-centered approach to take. There's also the why behind the measures and metrics. And as we start to talk about organizational practice, you'll hear me talk a lot about the times that we have responded by throwing things on the wall and seeing what sticks. We're going to do this training, we're going to do this program, and then see what happens. My favorite is we're going to do this survey or assessment. I'm a researcher. I love assessment. I think research and data is very helpful in this process to becoming more equitable. And what I've noticed, or what I've seen, are a lot of organizations, a lot of us, putting out surveys as a response, or almost as a Band-Aid, to say we're doing something, and collecting information, and then not having a plan for that information. Asking people questions, but not utilizing a level of incredible transparency to build trust-affirming practices. And so when it comes to inquisition, it's both in how we address and acknowledge people, leaning into what might be the deeper root of the challenges that we're experiencing, but it's also in how we do our assessment. One, if we're not collecting or looking at different demographic information, then we're even further off from being able to disaggregate it or to understand it. But something that folks who have experienced marginalization can likely attest to is that being asked questions without transparency as to why can also be something that feels really discomforting in our bodies. And so as we're inquiring, going that extra step, taking that extra effort to say, hey, we're collecting this demographic information about your identity because we want to ensure that the populations that we're serving, or that the staff that we have here, reflect the community at large. We're collecting this information about which language you utilize, so that we can gather more information about how we can have and train our staff. We're asking about your ethnic religious identity because we want to ensure that we have the resources here to be able to support you. We're asking about your gender identity to ensure that we are being as critically thoughtful as possible in our building new structure to ensure that we have accessible spaces that are inclusive to all people as part of our build. Why are you asking people the question? Because a lot of us have been asked these questions without knowing where the information goes. And it's very reasonable and appropriately adaptive to think and to know that it might have been used against us. You know, are we creating agreements about how data is being used, which is a beautiful prioritization that I'm seeing so much in among different tribal communities to ensure that any type of research that's being done or any type of conversation has a reciprocal value. We can cause a lot of harm by not being transparent with what and why we're asking, and then also what we're doing with it. Yes, every harvest requires preparation and tending. Yeah. So we also want to lean into what are some of the inquisition about what happened, realizing the potential widespread impact of trauma and understanding cultural responses in health and mental health, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in individuals, clients, families, and staff, being sure to integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, seeking to actively resist re-traumatization, and avoiding an ahistorical approach and seeking understanding. Put a hearts in the chat if this idea around inquisition resonates, about how we collect information or how we collect data. Okay. This concept of an ahistorical approach is an important one, because when I think about Ken Hardy, and Ken Hardy develops the tasks of the privileged and the subjugated. And in the tasks of the privilege, one of them is to be mindful of how we equate suffering. And the idea of equating suffering is something that many of us are probably familiar with. But in our roles and the work that we do, I often find that sometimes equating suffering isn't from this place of an intentional malice or trying to minimize someone else's experience. A lot of times it's in a way of trying to connect with other people. I know exactly what you're feeling. I completely understand, right? I know, let me give you this example. We want to create a space where we let people's stories and narratives and truths be present, where we lean into that historical approach, and that we recognize that the history of how things matter. We talked a little bit about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And taking that into account here is also important too. I've had folks say, oh, we don't do these types of interventions, or I don't do therapy, or I don't, or my family, we don't do this. And as someone who provides these services or, leans into wanting to create an environment where people can feel safe and trusted, I want to say, oh yeah, well, yeah, we do. Or, let me convince you why. Yeah, Brittany says that's a big one for sure. And one of the things that I had to sit with is to say, well, why is someone saying that? So we talked about 3 generations, 10 generations of things, of messages being sent, translated from generation to generation. We cannot acknowledge that for some of the services that we're providing, for some of this meaningful and dynamic support that we're doing, there's also been perpetuations of harm to communities. Right? People were marginalized and stigmatized around accessibility. People were marginalized and stigmatized around diagnoses, and continue to be. And in some ways, people were institutionalized or taken away from their homes. And it's a pervasive issue that we're continuing to respond to now with a level of like strategic urgency. And also 2 or 3 generations ago, people were seeing people be physically taken out of their homes at a much higher rate. And so it is reasonable and appropriately adaptive that grandparents or great grandparents would tell their children, you don't tell people what's going on here because I said so. And or maybe explaining why. But then that next generation that didn't really get it says, we just don't do that. And the next generation said, we just don't do that. And we get to this place where people say, well, I don't do this, or we don't do this. And it's valid because the systems that I'm part of and that I do my most amazing work in at some point perpetuated harm against the exact communities that I want to serve. And I need to name that and acknowledge it and say, you know what? At one point in our history, we were giving people a diagnosis for trying to escape enslavement. That's a real thing that happened. And so we have to acknowledge that history does matter, even if we don't know the history, because there's no way that everyone on here can know everything. It's not possible. But that historical context does matter. And so that inquisition allows us the opportunity to suspend the belief that we can fully comprehend or understand what people are experiencing, and leads us into a place of asking more critical questions. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to, I hear people saying like, okay, well, how do I have the physical conversation? So we're going to talk about organizational practices. We're also going to talk about interpersonal dynamics and relationships. So here are some ideas. Yeah, Tamika. Yeah, what goes on in this house stays in this house. Here's some interpersonal examples. So pausing for the wound. If I joined this session and I was bleeding from my arm, at least 30 people in the chat would say, you know what? It's all right, Ashley. You can take care of that. We'll wait 10 minutes. Or someone would physically address it. If we see someone who falls, we'll stop and check on them. With emotional wounds, particularly in our organizations, it's, are you okay? All right, well, I'm here for you if you need anything. And the pausing for the emotional wound doesn't happen in the same way. So we want to take moments to be present, to pause for the emotional wound. That emotional wound might be someone being defensive. That emotional wound might be someone getting up and walking out of the meeting because someone says something offensive and it was harmful to them. We want to pause and be present for the emotional wound. Observing. We don't want to, we'll talk a little bit about not wanting to speak for people in just a moment, but we also want to recognize that in order to be able to be present, we have to do work. And so during the pause, we want to breathe, we want to process, we want to inquire, asking those questions. Y'all will get sick of me saying inquisition in just a minute. We want to validate, acknowledge, and listen. This is really beginning to resist that writing reflex because we care about the families and the children and the communities that we're serving. We want to fix it. We want to make it better. We want to engage that writing reflex and suspend it for just a moment to continue to acknowledge and listen. To be present with folks. Now, many of us actually do really well with this, and we feel like we have the skills to do that. But then there's also the critical component of it that we need to address things. And that includes planning, responding, and preventing. I always think of a case study that one of my colleagues brought into one of our trainings, as it was a whole organization that was talking about the internal holidays that they were going to take off. And one of the other employees said, Juneteenth? Why do we have off for Juneteenth? Which one of our normal holidays is that going to replace instead? Right? That didn't sit well with a lot of people, understandably, and perpetuated a deep, microaggressive, ongoing, perpetual ouch for a lot of people in this space. And so the question comes up, like, how do you begin to respond? Because choosing not to respond or laughing it off, that has consequences. That's painful. Perhaps this person genuinely doesn't know. Okay, we need an opportunity to address, to plan, to respond, to prevent. But there's also some healing that needs to happen within that organization to acknowledge that that was said and that caused harm. And how do you maybe even work with that individual to see if they'd be willing to be accountable? Accountability is kind. Did you know that when you said that, it was really incredibly offensive? And I know folks are going to say, well, actually, there's some people who aren't going to care. They want to cause harm. And that's true. There might be some people who are indifferent to culture change, who benefit from a lack of culture change, and are okay with perpetuating harm. But I tend to find that in general, it's mostly discomfort that keeps people from taking that accountability or engaging in the conversation. And those folks tend to, be more, less of the dominant voice within our organizations and the type of work that we do. And in the cases where we are, then we need full culture change. Yeah, Jasmine, that's another wonderful example. A lot of organizations I work with had similar discussions around Columbus Day and what that means and the harm that is evoked for communities as we talk about or uplift Columbus Day. Right? Yep, Thanksgiving. And this also includes the lack of honoring of particular holidays or observed days for different cultures that we don't even talk about within the workplace. Now I have some folks who are like, okay, that sounds good, but I'm aware enough to know that I shouldn't go around speaking for other people. I want to be an advocate for myself and for other people, but I also realize that I don't want to speak for other people. And so I walk people through the concept of like advocating from I. I am a person who has a lot of things for myself that I feel is important to advocate for, but I'm also aware that I stand in solidarity. Some people might choose to use the word allyship with other folks as well in the goal towards being a more equitable organization. And so we don't want to performatively speak for people, but some of us, based on our positionality, are in spaces to really call into question whether or not the voices of those who decisions are impacting have access to contribute their realities. And so I might be in a space that's looking at the building design for gender inclusive or all inclusive restroom spaces, or how to increase mobile accessibility into a building. I've been in several rooms like that. And we're talking about if and how and when we're going to do this, if we do this or when we do this. And advocating from I really looked like saying, we're talking about if and when we're going to do this, as if embracing or creating an environment that acknowledges people's identities as an option. Advocating for myself is I'm uncomfortable with the if conversation that's happening here. These are people's human rights and basic rights, and we need to find a strategy to ensure that this happens and talk about what the next steps will be. I'll also advocate for myself. I am uncomfortable that we're having this conversation without including any folks from our community who navigate and overcome this barrier on a day-to-day basis in this decision-making process. I am uncomfortable with that. And most people are more comfortable starting from that place because we don't want to speak for other people. We don't also want to take the space from other folks to be able to express what they are navigating. And so Ken Hardy also talks about people who aren't being listened to. I mean, people who are not being listened to. We want to ask, who's not being listened to and why? Who's not being listened to and why? Advocate from I. We also want to have conversations about observing our zones of engagement. So this came up earlier when someone was posing a question about, okay, what about those maybe folks who are apprehensive or have the privilege or opportunity to leave a conversation? So some of these might be resonating with folks is like learning zones, right? Because it's adapted from the learning zone. The stretch zone is often the place that people say that we want to be. It's a place where we're leaning in, we're having like a nervous excitement for the content, we're really deeply and meaningfully engaged. So that's that stretch zone. The comfort zone is where we're really present, but familiar and not all that motivated towards change, but just engaging. And then there's a panic zone. The panic zone is where people start to feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable, maybe avoiding. This is where I see a lot of people say, I need to take a break, or you start to see the scrolling or, people leaving a particular situation. And the question we want to pose is, am I stepping out of this space because I have the privilege to disengage? Or is this activating something for and within me that I need to learn more? This plays a really important role in equity. I saw this a lot when I was doing these trainings, particularly it was very pervasive when I was doing things about police, community policing, and police brutality over the last 5 years. And what would happen is, as I would talk about the history of policing or the history of slave patrols and night watchers, and talk about the conflicts that communities, organizations were experiencing as it related to relationships with law enforcement, a lot of people go into their panic zone. We would go into the panic zone for multitudes of different reasons. Some of us were going because we have loved ones that have been overly policed or harmed by law enforcement. Some of us would go into our panic zone because our friend, uncle, cousins, brother, sister, ourselves are members of law enforcement, and we worry about their safety in their line of work, or we know them very well and we know that they are actively trying to engage in community-based policing in a climate that was very hard for them to navigate. People were going into panic zones for their own experiences and fears associated with it. And people would immediately begin to disengage. That panic zone played a really important role in equity because people were disengaging to where we weren't looking at or able to really process through what needed to happen. So acknowledging that panic zone was absolutely important to have meaningful and productive conversations, to recognize that we are people with experiences that are showing up as part of this conversation, and we can go in and out of these zones and conversations. It's not stagnant, but really sitting with ourselves when we're in that panic zone and observing. Am I choosing to disengage for my own comfort? I know someone asked earlier, like, to divine our fragility. Our fragility is when we feel like something is being attacked. And so we feel very fragile and defensive, right? Or feeling attacked when something comes up that is really valid and important for other people, but we feel associated with it in some way. And so we put up our defenses instead of being present and acknowledging the other truths that are in the room. What is activating us in the space to observe our zones? And so I would love for folks to share in the chat. When I'm going to put it like this, when something happens and you're like, uh-oh, man, you have the uh-oh feeling. And we all know what the uh-oh feeling is. How do you know? What are some of the things that show up in your body that let you know that an inequity has occurred, that something needs to be addressed? Your facial expression changes, the pit in the stomach, upset stomach, heaviness, palms get clammy, eye contact, your stomach drops, anger, rapid heart rate, tense feelings. You start to get a headache, you get antsy, you start to feel physically hot, warm, and itchy, right? All of these things that our bodies are sending us cues. Your face starts yelling. I've never heard that expressed like that, and I love it because I know exactly what that means. You start to feel overstimulated. Your chest starts to tighten. You pause. Yeah. You zone out. You start taking deeper breaths. Start sweating. Disconnecting. Right? Yes, these are some things that folks experience. Facial expressions start to change. Eye contact, you start to divert. You maybe lean in. Your tone starts to change. It gets softer, right? Even my tone changing right now might have said someone into their panties, so, right? Because it's connected to our experiences. Physical distance, moving closer, leaning out. Experiencing fear of how people will see you, making jokes, Deborah, minimizing. Oh, no. Come on, y'all. We really don't have to get into this today. Comedy, lightening the mood. Well, shutting down, worrying how people will perceive you, intellectualizing. Well, Stewart 2024 says, that disbelief. Oh, I can't believe you said that, right? Distancing ourselves from other people. Silence. Feeling that urge to say something. Politeness. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Disgust towards others. Right. So Carlton Green and colleagues really look at the anxious symptoms that come up, or the anxious expressions that come up when we engage in equity-centered conversations. Now, if you notice from the things that we put into the room, and even some of these things, most of us will say like that's a natural cue to get on out of a situation. Maybe that's something we then go get in the car and call someone like, you won't believe what just happened here within my organization. But I want to reframe these cues in our bodies. When you start to feel that face tense up, when you start to see yourself get distracted, when you start to do, mine says that chuckle, that laugh, and it's not nothing's funny, but that's my cue. I start to feel tingling in my hands. When you start to feel the need to pray for patience, when you start to shake, when you start to worry, when you feel your face look shocked or someone says it, what if we take that cue? And that cue is now our ability to say, okay, I'm feeling this pit in my stomach. Something inequitable has happened. And within our strengths, finding a way to respond. I think that when it comes to responding within organizations, we don't have enough conversations about different ways that people can contribute to bringing things into the space. We often, as we'll see in a later slide, we like uplift and we recognize that we have like people who are really good at saying what needs to be said in the moment, and we sometimes rely on those folks to say what needs to be said, right? But we all have natural strengths in how we will respond. Maybe you're a very attentive person and you then become hyper aware of what's going on and you make note of the details. That's important to addressing inequities in the workplace. Maybe you're a person who will go up to someone later and check in with them and say, I observed this. That validation, that's an important role in moving towards an equity-centered, trauma-informed organizational practice. Maybe you're the person that, like myself, is going to say, I'm sorry. I really feel like we need to take a moment to reflect on some harm that might have been caused in this room. That's an important role. And that's one that folks can do. Maybe you're the type of person who goes to the person who causes the harm and says, hey, I used to think the same thing. And then someone told me this and it really changed my perspective. My goodness, that's an important role. Maybe you're really great note taker and you follow up on it, or you're able to provide a different level of clarity about what happened in that moment because you didn't react in one of those other ways. That's an important role. And so leaning into your strength is going to be so helpful in evoking a healing-centered organizational culture. What are your strengths? What is within your comfort zone, right? I believe everyone should get out of our comfort zone and we should engage differently. And also within our comfort zone, there are a lot of different responses. Because as soon as this cue starts to evoke, your body's telling you that something needs to be addressed here. And how can you activate your natural way of responding? Because the biggest threat we run is to do nothing at all. Yeah. Right. Yeah, Debbie says, when you're not part of a marginalized group, you might want to do that. Advocate from I and really speak about what you experienced and observed. Yeah. Yeah. Anita said, I'm saying something, right? What are your natural strengths and how do you lean into those? The CDC Center for Preparedness and Response talks about safety, trustworthy, transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment of voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender responses as part of a trauma-informed response. All right, let's talk about some organizational practices. We've talked about equity-centered practices, culture of authenticity. We've talked about the role of equity. We talked about stress responses. We've talked about truth, trust, and trauma. Right, I see some questions. We don't want to miss those. So I know we'll probably have some more questions in the Q&A too. We have the trauma-informed practices that we talked about. So let's talk about systemic and structural responses. How does a parent help a child that's been exposed to chronic trauma? Yeah. I think there's something even really powerful in acknowledging or creating space for that to be discussed or to show up. Yeah, I think so. Oh yeah, it could so be applied to parenting. It could apply to most important parts of our lives. And even as we get into the organizational or like the systemic structural part, you'll see that I've used these in different parts of work too. Yeah. So I like this as we talk about the layers of racism, the dimensions of racism, or dimensions of oppression more broadly. I really love this image because it shows it in a complex, simplistic, complex way that shows that it's layered. So people aren't only experiencing internalized, those subtle messages that are reinforced. It's not just interpersonal, which are those interactions that we talked about earlier. We tend to spend a lot of time talking about those interpersonal experiences, but it's also internalized. And I think that the internalization part is really important for us as we talk about healing-centered organizations. This could often look like, oh, I will speak for this group because people will listen to me. That is not coming from a place of malice. That's not coming from a place of malice at all. And also, it's internalizing some idea that is going to be best received from me and buying into that idea or concept, as opposed to saying, why aren't people being listened to and why, and creating a space for people with lived expertise, your families who have the living and lived expertise about their families to be paramount. For the young people listening, young people are so unlistened to, right? Because of many biases that they don't know things or they can't express things. There's also some intersectional experiences for young people right now that many, I'll use myself as an example. I don't know what it's like to grow up in this time with this many competing demands, with this much stimuli in a constant and chronic space. It's unique. And so we want to lean into that and listen to people. But sometimes we'll say, I'm going to speak for young people because they'll listen to me, for the children because they'll listen to me. Are we also really creating access so that when young people speak, they're being listened to? Mm-hmm. It is really unique, yes. Then you have the structural, multiple institutions upholding policies, practices, and procedures. And then, of course, institutional, right? And so it's not, people aren't experiencing it at one level. People are experiencing it at multiple levels, and it ultimately begins to compound. When we start to look at the experiences within our institutions, within our organizations, we want to acknowledge that implicit bias, explicit bias, and institutional bias show up. We talk a lot about implicit, explicit, I find. And the reality is institutional bias shows up a lot too. Yeah. I want to acknowledge Brina in the chat, who's bringing in lived expertise. Thank you. From Youth Move. Thank you for sharing that. And uplifting that pressures of that there are unique pressures on young people. And as a young adult, young adults can be put down or shut down very easily, not taken seriously. But if we really want to know how to engage change, we have to be able to be inclusive and equitable. But most importantly, lean into that lived expertise, that generational expertise. And that happens on a multitude of different levels. So institutional biases look at the practices or procedures and norms that favor one norm over the other. Now, this doesn't have to be any like intentional discriminatory, but us just following our day-to-day or general assumptions about environment. That's how we have always done it. Or, leaning into the practices. So this is how we do it here. That might be, this is the best way to provide this type of service. And so an accountability check can be, what is usual or normal to me? And is that cultural? Is that perpetuating a dominant cultural ideological norm within our institutions? Normal is relative and individual. I love that. Yep. And so we want to ensure that we're addressing cultural imperialism, that we're addressing interpersonal harm and structural barriers. Couple more quotes just to kind of loop in what we talked about earlier to now this conversation about organizational change. So as we think about what the impact will be in the organization, authenticity creates a work culture where people feel more in tune, connected to their work community, and loyal to their organization and its purpose. This attracts and retains talented people who do their best work. When people are able to experience being themselves, they don't have to hide or cover up the differences that make them unique. And so we have a really dynamic crowdsourcing exercise that we want to do in the end. So I'm going to just pose this question to the chat to say, when we address institutional biases, institutional norms, what do we gain? So the question I pose to this group is, when we address institutional biases and norms, ideas of norms, what do we gain? Trust affirming practices, unity, knowledge and perspective, new perspectives, better understanding, relief, safer spaces, safety, better morale. And so a lot of times I like to just get ahead of the question. It's okay, well, what do you do when there's leaders or people who are just apprehensive to it? There's leaders who are interested in the success of their organizations see these types of traits: creativity, growth, experiences, unity, right? Connection, greater work ethic. Those are all variables that support any organization. And so promoting cultural changes that will lead to that will inevitably be a dynamic shift for everyone involved. And so sometimes the bigger barrier that I'm seeing is a lack of cohesion and connection and giving equity-forward and equity-centered approaches a genuine chance, or that work is falling on the responsibility or the work of people who are usually most marginalized by those experiences, people advocating for themselves. That's why we start off with this work is for everyone to do. And when that culture begins to change, inevitably, what I see in action is that when these outcomes that you all are putting in the chat start to show up as a result of it, so do the outcomes around the work that we're attempting to do, and the culture begins to shift. This work cannot be relegated onto people who are personally impacted to have to advocate for themselves. This is everyone's lane. Yeah. Yeah, Kevin says, is there, I'm not sure the exact term that you're thinking of when marginalized folks have to coach the systems for change. It's at the tip of my tongue. I don't know that, yes, but I'm also thinking of, it's exploitive. I see a question up on the screen. I can see it on my secondhand monitor. Could you, Sufi, did you want to bring this question into the space? I see it on the screen, but it's on my little screen. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dr. Stewart, which question would you like?
Being authentic improves productivity and increases performance and success. It allows employees to exert less energy and time censoring or hiding themselves. Employees often link these themes. Spending less time and energy on self-monitoring freed up more energy for focusing on the task at hand. This is an objective that organizational leaders, managers, and individuals at all levels of the organization want to see. Again, it is really critical, really important that the responsibility of creating healing-centered organizations and creating equitable change not only fall on individuals who are self-advocating or teaching others, but that we all see our role in making that change.
Stewart?
So, oh, I hear someone.
Hi, Dr. Stewart. It was me, Ashley. Is there a question you would like me to bring on the stage? How do you manage and advocate for yourself if your upper management may be unintentionally insensitive or uninformed on how to speak with staff in a way that promotes a safe and social engagement system? Is that the question you would like?
I hadn't seen that question. That's a great question. I did see a question on the stage. Perhaps that's the one that was there. Hi. But certainly we can talk about that. You know, I think that goes back to the rule to revisit, right? I'm pulling it out right now. I think it goes back to one of the very first slides, which is accountability is kind. And you know, that is perpetuating harm at a multitude of different levels. Now, there's going to be some folks based on positionality where we don't feel as safe to bring that up to leadership. And also, I think that in instances I've had a lot of luck, especially because the person in the question said unintentional. If there's even a consideration that it could be unintentional, then it's, you know, hey, Ashley, use myself as an example. I know that this organization is committed to serving families and children. And I know that it's committed to reducing disparities. I just want to bring up that when we do X, Y, or Z, or when we don't do X, Y, or Z, I think that's a huge barrier to people feeling like they're able to reach our organization's mission. And I don't know if you realize it, but when you do this, that is you know, creating tension among our teams to be able to do that most effectively. And I know you care about it, so that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. If this person is unintentionally, unwillingly knowing that, that's a very kind thing to do so that they can do something different.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. You're doing a great job, by the way, Dr. Stewart. You're doing a fantastic job.
I see the questions and things. I also see a lot of conversation happening in the chat. And I just want to say, you know, continuing to create space for each other in this chat to process through what this actually looks like, and uplifting that we're working with communities and with families and with young folks who have been continuously silenced. And so we're talking right now about organizational practices we always want to keep at the center of our attention, how this translates into supporting communities. All right. Regrounding as we go into some more strategies. We've talked about healing-centered trauma-informed best practices. Conversations with peers is also great. Absolutely. The culture of authenticity, the role of equity, stress responses, truth, trust, and trauma. systemic and structural oppressions. And now we're going to talk a little bit about culture change. So I'm going to talk about some.
Hey, Dr. Stewart. sorry to interrupt. I wanted to hop in with one question I think is related to this kind of shift in topic is, and I'm just going to read it out. So it says, Beth says, rather than say, I'll speak for X, saying in a larger public meeting, I'll introduce you to speak, or in a less formal meeting, saying, quote, I see X wants to share, bring attention to invite others to speak. Are these appropriate and helpful?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's multiple approaches, right? So I think I heard the first part of it. Let me see if I can actually pull that up so I can look at the examples, right? So rather than saying, speaking for someone, you'll introduce them and say, I love the idea of introducing folks. Or that could look like a one-on-one conversation to say, hey, I'll use my own name again. Hey, Ashley, I noticed that you advocate for this a lot. There's a conversation that's happening about it. Would you be okay if I introduce you to the group that's making these decisions for your feedback, and making sure that they'll be able to have a space to really contribute and in a space that would be a reduction of harm. Or, if you see someone who's being continuously overlooked or not responded to, say, I'm feeling uncomfortable with the fact that there have been a lot of people who have been attempting to contribute, but we're not making spaces. I'm wondering if we could think about a different way to have this conversation so all voices can be included, right? So one of the things we want to be mindful of is advocating from or advocating with and in solidarity with other people isn't throwing people into space or saying, I know that upset you, so I'm going to create a space. But checking in, that going back to that concept of inquisition, I noticed that when you left the meeting, I perceived you to be upset. Is there anything I can do to support? And if you're in a space where that person's not there, then creating a space to say, I don't think we've heard all perspectives. Might we strategize about how to do that? Because I don't think that this is actually reflecting what insert name or what people in our community are experiencing. So yes, I do think that context absolutely plays a role. I think that sensitivity plays a role. We don't want to put anyone in a compromising position, but when we speak from it through the lens of ourselves, we're not putting anyone in a position where we're speaking for them. We're actually creating a space where we are inviting people in. Yeah, awesome. When I see some requests for some of the quotes, we can make sure that the quotes, that you all get the quotes as well. They're also in the resources that are attached to it. I love that, Kevin. So equity culture shifts, pivots and pitfalls. So I've been referring to it as these are common pitfalls. And I love this resource here that talks about equity pitfalls that we tend to see or find ourselves in. And I want to address that, but I also want to address them as opportunities for pivots too, because I think that finding the strength in is on the other side of acknowledging this pivot. So one of the pivots I want to highlight is, instead of doing equity or treating it as a tool, strategy, a 10-point plan, instead really acknowledging that it's a whole system, whole person change. Equity initiatives are often siloed to several policy teams or work groups, and instead we really need to look at how everyone can utilize their strengths in leveraging towards a more inclusive environment. That the responsibility is distributed among the different departments or teams, so that everyone can see immediately what are the potential things we want to respond to. Oh, perfect. Beth will make sure that happens. Then there is the that really charismatic person who does a great job at bringing those equity initiatives to the forefront of attention. And while we all very much appreciate this individual, we want to build up the strengths of other folks to be able to speak and address. And maybe it's in a different way, right? Because it's not always verbal. There's a lot of ways that we can respond, and making sure that people are developing their unique skills and within our abilities within our bodies to be able to contribute. There's some things we try to be all present in conversational without action. And sometimes there's action without conversation. It's about striking a really important balance there. And then, of course, I talked about it earlier, just trying things, throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks is not a very trust-affirming process. We want to be able to navigate with a level of urgency, but I like to call it strategic urgency. And so here are two quick frameworks that I developed that I think are really helpful for organizational level to do this. So whether it's within team meetings or within the structures, having a processing of FAQs, and the FAQs are the facts, assumptions, and critical questions. So when there is a disruption, these are the next two are responding to different disruptions that might happen. What are the facts of the situation? What are the assumptions that we're making? And then what are the critical questions? And those critical questions will be the target points of which we start our intervention or our response, right? We talked about earlier, you want to be able to engage and to be present and to validate, but we also want to take action. So the critical questions will lead us to our action points about what happened and how people are feeling, because that's all assumptions. But we do want to create an opportunity for critical questions to develop a meaningful intervention or response, folks, if the word intervention doesn't speak. Yes. Yeah, I see quite a few delays, but I'm so glad that people are joining into the conversation. Yeah, Frankie, I love talking about strategic urgency. We also want to acknowledge that people might be apprehensive to engage for some other reasons too. Change fatigue, people are afraid of change, or maybe people have been pouring themselves into change for quite some time and not seeing a result. That's exhausting. Right? Compassion fatigue, something that's pervasive in our organizations, and I believe you're going to talk more about compassion fatigue and burnout throughout the day. And decision fatigue. People who are experiencing systemic and structural marginalization often make more decisions in a single day than others, which can be exhausting. And so we want to take these things into consideration to assure that everyone's listened to. This next framework is one of my personal favorites, is the authentic change framework. And I use this framework when I help organizations develop like statements. Yes, so the slides are available in the resources section. I know some folks are having trouble accessing that, but yes, make sure you have that. The framework that this is, I use this to help people when we're developing, like a North Star document, or maybe something has happened that needs to be acknowledged. And so the authentic change framework, I like to think of it as accountability over apologies. And so to bring it into a really straightforward example, I could tell you, hey, I'm sorry for X, Y, or Z. Or I could take accountability. And so what this really looks like, and think of this through organizational lens, there's some things that we need to acknowledge. This is getting to the equity piece. Acknowledge with clarity the inequities both past and present. Our organization has done a really great job at serving our communities. And also we have let out a tremendous number of our population who are not able to access our services because of X, Y, or Z. It demonstrates that there is a level of knowledge that we've done something to understand the truths that are faced with the populations and the communities we're serving, the families we're serving. The accountability component comes in to take accountability for the missteps, the ignorance, the participation, the complicity, and sometimes it's missed opportunities. Sometimes we're doing a really great job and there's a space and place to do even more. And so this is and as a result, our organization acknowledges that we have missed opportunities to be intentional and thoughtful about including XY community. It's hard to apologize. And taking accountability is one of the ways that we build trust affirming practices. And last but certainly not least, we engage with action. And so we demonstrate our awareness by stating actionable steps towards a different outcome. And as a result, we will. This might be in your team. This might be your whole organization. But this is where we start to really lean in. And I've had the privilege to work with many, many organizations to do this in a very thoughtful and intentional way that has led to creating the path forward that everyone involved in the community can take to be able to make agency-wide changes. And this authentic change acknowledges the truth of a situation, that we're action focused, and that we're building trust. Yeah. And so I believe this is my last slide, which is good because I have one exercise I'd like for us to do together. But people really love this one too. And this one is adapted from Noster, and it is the necessary ingredients for change. And as your team begins to think about what next steps look like, taking actionable next steps, leaving here and saying, we're doing this today. We had a great conversation, and also, let's start working towards this. I think this really helps us think about it. So I like to put it like this. I am not a good baker, but I do know that if you don't have the right ingredients, it's not going to come out correctly at all. Unfortunately, I've learned that many hard ways by trying to make cakes without with baking soda instead of baking powder. And clearly I don't even know which one's which now. You need the right ingredients for change to occur. Are people laughing at me because I don't know how to bake? Yes, please feel welcome to use the framework. Yeah. So let's say you feel like your team has the skills. They know what they're doing and how to do it. Maybe they have the incentive. The incentives, they feel really motivated towards the change. Folks have the resources, right? There's people power, there's maybe the financial resources, there's the allocated and designated effort. And maybe we even have an action plan. We know what those next steps are. But we don't have a vision. We don't know what the bigger picture is going to be. That can lead people to confusion. But let's say we have the vision. We know where we're going. We feel very incentivized in this work. We have the resources to do it and an action plan. But people don't know how to do it, and we don't have the skills. That can lead to anxious feelings, which can delay our progress. If we have the vision, we have the skills, the resources, and we have an action plan, but no incentives, we get that slow, incremental change. Right? Not the strategic urgency we want to move with. If we have the vision, skills, incentives, and action plan, but no resources, my goodness, anyone's tried to do anything without resources? Yeah, it's frustrating, right? Right. So we need the resources as well. Let's say we have the vision, the skills, right? The incentives and the resources, but no action plan. False starts trying things. So we want to say, okay, and you'll see in the implementation handout that you have, maybe you start by saying, okay, what ingredients do my team have? And what ingredients do we need? Maybe it's something on the sheet, maybe something else. But maybe you even go from a diagnostic perspective of saying, we're really confused. Maybe we need to do a visioning exercise. People are very frustrated towards this change. Maybe we need to look at more resources and beginning to take those next steps. Fail to plan to fail, right? I love one of my favorite things to say to people is to be prepared for the yes. A lot of times the questions I get are like prepared for apprehension and or prepared for conflict. And that's because many of us in our work, we have to combat a lot of different systems, and that makes sense. I also want us to be prepared for the yes. So when the yes happens, we have what we need to see it through. I was wrong. This is probably the last slide, maybe. We want to challenge ourselves. We want to be clear. Okay, a lot of times we use language that's fluffy and, nice, but we want to be really clear. We want to be able to name things. That builds trust. You can say, our organization is committed to ensuring that everybody's voice is represented. Saying, I know this community's voice has not been represented because is much more trust affirming. Yeah, Bethany. Yeah, I do have whole trainings on just how to implement that. So, but it's a good first step to take back to our agencies to use. But yes, and then culture shifts. We want to avoid actions. We want to commit because change fatigue is real. I love to say we have to be just as consistent as the forms of oppression. And we want to ensure that it's not something that's sprinkled on top, it's not an additive, but culture shift and equity are deeply rooted in our organizations. I know some folks had questions about implementation and doing, and there's so much we can cover in 3 hours. I welcome folks to continue to stay in touch or to even ask more questions, because I did say we have a role to revisit. So as people process or think about what this looks like in your organizations, I welcome you to reach out. I'm so grateful to be able to present at the Systems of Care Virtual Summit. And I know that you're going to have a bunch more presentations that bring this content together. And also, I also welcome a continued conversation here in this space as well as we think about it. Before folks break, I want to be able to give you all something after this that continues the conversation. So we have prepared thank you everyone, for us to do just a quick crowdsource. And so what I'm asking for folks is I would love to know, given the content we talked about today, what is your boldest idea about what you can do within your organization? And Suki, if there's a way that we can bring this up and gather that information so I can share it out afterwards. Okay, so you'll have popped up on your screen a thought exchange link, right? And if you click into that thought exchange link, you'll see a prompt. And Elizabeth created it for us. And it says, based upon your learning today, what is your boldest and most equity-forward idea to create a healing-centered organization? And if you click get started and next and accept the privacy notice, you can share your first thought. You can share why it's so important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect these different responses, and we're going to send something out that gives you some ideas from other people in this room about what bold, big next steps we can take to ensure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. We are going to wrap up today. We're so grateful for your presentation, and please stay connected on that thought exchange. It will be open for some time, and I'm going to turn it over to Ashley Singleton to close us out.
Hey, everyone, y'all continue.
Oh, shit.
Okay, we have some movement happening in the background. So let's continue to give claps and spirit fingers and all the wonderful things for Dr. Stewart and also for Sonja and our ASL interpreters that have been with us for the entire 3 hours. Thank you, everyone, so much. Tomorrow is a big day. We have multiple presenters, keynote presentations, the networking lounge. So make sure you grab your snacks, your water, come prepared to share this space with us tomorrow. If you need to watch this again, or you'd like to rewatch this session after it ends, there will be a button next to the title of the session in the schedule. It will say watch replay. Click that button and you can rewatch Dr. Stewart in this fabulous training as often as you like. We're also going to have all of the recordings from the summit posted to our YouTube channel. I'm going to launch a link in just a second here. You click that link and you can go to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so that you can watch the recordings and get the latest updates from the summit. So we will continue to keep the summit platform open for another two. Take a look at the lightning talks, our partner booths, review the resources. Also, bookmark sessions so you don't miss upcoming sessions for the rest of the week. Please be sure to respond to the thought exchange that Dr. Stewart shared with us, because we will create a resource with those thoughts and share it back out to the audience. Again, I want to say a really big thank you to everyone that was in front of the screen and behind the screen participating in the summit. We couldn't do it without you. We'll see you tomorrow. Make sure you take part in the feedback survey. That link will be posted in the chat, or it is posted in the chat. That's your ticket. That's your key to the continuing education hours request form. You must complete that survey in order to request those hours. So I think that's it. I hope that you all have a good rest of your day. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow.